When my own flesh and blood handed the keys to my life's work over to his wife, I felt the ghost of every single night I had slept on a cot beside that front counter. She looked at me with a cold, triumphant smile and told me my time was over. But she did not know that inside the very walls of that shop, hidden within the heart of an antique clock, a silent witness was ticking away, waiting to expose the final devastating lie she thought she had buried. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 68 years old, and for the past 40 years I have lived my life by the rhythm of ticking gears, winding springs, and chiming pendulums. I am a master horologist. I own Caldwell antique timepieces nestled right in the heart of historic Lancaster, Pennsylvania. If you have ever been to Lancaster, you know it is a place where American history breathes through the brickwork and the cobblestone streets. Our shop was a living, breathing piece of that history. I spent 4 decades hunched over heavy wooden workbenches with a jeweler's loop pressed to my eye, carefully restoring 18th century grandfather clocks and delicate vintage pocket watches. I gave my entire youth and my absolute soul to that shop. I sacrificed countless family dinners, weekend fishing trips, and quiet evenings at home, all to build a completely debt-free legacy for my only son, Julian. I wanted to hand him a kingdom of brass and mahogany, a respected business that would provide for him and his children long after my hands finally stopped working. My late wife Sarah and I built every shelf, polished every glass pane, and nurtured every customer relationship with our own sweat and tears. When Sarah passed away from breast cancer 5 years ago, that shop became my sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where I could still feel her presence, where I could still hear her gentle voice echoing in the steady, familiar rhythm of the antique clocks we had sourced together across the country. Lately, however, my body had started to betray my dedication. The arthritis in my hands and knees had become a daily burning agony. Tasks that used to take me 20 minutes, like calibrating a delicate escapement wheel or carefully replacing a coiled mainspring, were suddenly taking me grueling hours. I had to face the bitter reality of my aging body. It was time to step back. Julian and I had discussed it for months, poring over the details late into the evening. The plan was simple, respectful, and filled with love. I would hand over the daily management and the heavy physical restoration work to him, while I would retain a consultative role. I would come in a few times a week, sit in my leather chair in the back office, sip my black coffee, and offer my expertise on the rare, highly complex pieces that required decades of specific knowledge. It was supposed to be a graceful transition. I was supposed to be a father proudly watching his son take the helm of a thriving, highly respected American business. That was exactly what I expected on that freezing, rain-soaked Tuesday morning. The Lancaster sky was a heavy, bruising gray, and a steady downpour washed the historic streets as I parked my truck around the block from the shop. I pulled my thick canvas collar up against the bitter chill, holding a white cardboard box of fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. I had bought warm cherry danishes, Julian's favorite since he was a little boy, to celebrate our first official day of the new arrangement. As I walked up to the heavy oak and glass front doors of Caldwell antique timepieces, my heart swelled with a profound mixture of melancholy for the passing of an era and intense pride for my son's future. I was ready to pass the torch. But when I reached the entrance, the heavy deadbolt was engaged. The shop was dark and locked. It was past our usual opening time. I peered through the rain-streaked glass, shielding my eyes from the glare, and saw Julian standing just inside the vestibule. He was not alone. His wife Chloe stood right beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Now you have to understand the dynamic with Chloe. She was 32 years old, sharp, calculating, and always dressed in high-end designer clothes that felt aggressively flashy for a traditional hard-working town like ours. She possessed a degree in business marketing and never missed a single opportunity to remind everyone around her of that fact. I had always tried my absolute best to welcome her into our family, deliberately ignoring the subtle, condescending remarks she made at the Thanksgiving table about our quaint, old-fashioned way of doing business. Julian, who was 35, had always been a gentle, somewhat passive man. He loved deeply, but he avoided conflict at all absolute costs. Over the years, I had watched with quiet concern as Chloe slowly molded him, isolating him from his old high school friends and subtly dominating his financial and personal decisions. But he was my son, my own flesh and blood, and I loved him unconditionally. I tapped the cold glass with my knuckle, holding up the bakery box with a warm, encouraging smile. Julian slowly reached forward and unlocked the door, but he only pushed it open a few inches. He did not step aside to let me out of the freezing rain. The warm, comforting air of the shop drifted out, carrying the deeply familiar scent of old, seasoned wood brass polish and fine machine oil. But something was terribly, instantly wrong. Julian's face was chalky pale. His eyes darted nervously to the wet pavement, to the passing cars, anywhere but directly at my face. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous, fearful habit he had kept since he was a little boy, trying to hide a bad report card from his mother. I asked him why the shop was closed, and if we were going to go over the transition documents over coffee. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He stammered, shifting his weight awkwardly from foot to foot. He told me that plans had changed over the weekend. He said they had been reviewing the business model and decided that a clean break would be much better for everyone moving forward. Then, extending a trembling, hesitant hand, he looked at my chest and awkwardly asked me to surrender my master set of keys. I stood there in the freezing rain, the white pastry box growing damp and soft in my grip. I could not comprehend the words coming out of his mouth. I asked him what on earth he meant by a clean break. Before my son could utter another pathetic, mumbled excuse, Chloe pushed the heavy oak door wide open and stepped aggressively right in front of him. She did not ask. She reached out with lightning speed and snatched the heavy brass keyring straight out of my numb, arthritic fingers. The metal jingled sharply in the damp air, a sound that felt exactly like a physical slap across my face. Chloe looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my worn canvas work jacket and my rain-dampened gray hair with absolute, undisguised disgust. She smirked, a cold, brutally calculating expression that burned itself into my memory. She looked around the beautiful historic shop that Sarah and I had built with our bare hands, sacrificing our youth to make it perfect, and then she looked right into my eyes. "Your time is over, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with venomous, mocking satisfaction. "We are modernizing. This dusty old museum is done." As if her cruel words were a predetermined signal, a large unmarked white panel van pulled up aggressively directly to the curb right behind me. 3 burly, unsmiling contractors jumped out into the puddles, carrying heavy sledgehammers, iron crowbars, and massive power tools. They pushed right past me without a word of excuse, tracking mud and dirty rainwater across the pristine, hand-polished hardwood floors of our showroom. I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as Chloe directed them immediately toward the back wall. That wall held the magnificent custom-built mahogany display cases that Sarah and I had commissioned and helped build 30 years ago. They were intricately hand-carved, specifically designed with internal climate control to regulate humidity for the most fragile, historically significant antique pocket watches in the entire state. They were the crown jewels of our shop, a testament to my late wife's impeccable taste and dedication. Chloe pointed at them with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand and told the foreman to tear it all down to the studs. She loudly announced that she wanted cheap open-concept floating shelves and bright neon backlighting to attract a younger demographic. The pastry box slipped from my grasp, hitting the wet sidewalk with a dull thud. The cherry danishes spilled into a muddy puddle, completely ruined. I stepped forward into the shop, my heart hammering against my ribs, raising my voice over the sudden violent, terrifying sound of a steel crowbar smashing directly into the antique mahogany. The sound of that beautiful historic wood splintering and cracking hit me like a physical suffocating blow to the chest. The glass shattered, raining down like diamonds on the floor. I yelled at them to stop immediately. I turned frantically to my son, grabbing him tightly by the shoulders of his expensive sweater. I pleaded with him. I told him those cases were a fundamental part of his mother's legacy, that her own hands had sanded that wood. I begged Julian to look at me, to act like the strong, principled man I had spent my life raising to stop this senseless, disrespectful destruction of our family's heritage. Julian flinched violently, pulling away from my desperate grasp, as if my touch burned him. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of the warmth and respect I had known for 35 years. He muttered defensively that I needed to calm down and stop acting crazy. He told me, parroting her words exactly, that Chloe had her business marketing degree and she knew exactly what the modern affluent demographic wanted. He told me I was stubbornly living in the past and that my emotional outburst was embarrassing him in front of the contractors. I was practically pleading now, hot tears of frustration, anger, and absolute heartbreak mixing with the cold rainwater dripping down my face. I told them they had absolutely no right to do this. I was the founder. My blood was in the mortar of these bricks. My name was etched on the sign hanging above the building. But Chloe just rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, mocking sigh, and gestured casually to the largest of the contractors. A man twice my size, wearing dirty steel-toed boots, walked over with an intimidating glare. He placed his thick, calloused hands heavily on my shoulders and physically forced me backward toward the entrance. I tried to plant my feet, tried to resist, but my 68-year-old joints, burning with the fiery agony of severe arthritis, were absolutely no match for his brute strength. He shoved me forcefully out the front door, stumbling me right back into the pouring, freezing rain. I barely caught my balance before falling onto the wet concrete. Chloe stepped gracefully up to the threshold, looking down at me with a victorious, icy glare. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, locked the massive deadbolt with a loud, final echoing click, and casually flipped the open sign to closed. I was left standing completely alone on the wet, unforgiving sidewalk. The rain soaked through my canvas jacket, chilling me to the bone. I stood there staring through the rain-streaked glass at my own son, who cowardly turned his back on me and walked away into the shadows of the shop. I stood there completely helpless, while the agonizing, violent sound of heavy sledgehammers continued to rip my life's work, my wife's memory, and my family legacy to absolute shreds. The devastation was so profound, so absolute, that I felt as if the ground beneath Lancaster had simply opened up to swallow me. I slowly walked back to my truck, my entire body trembling with a mixture of physical cold and a deep, agonizing betrayal. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key into the ignition. I sat there in the silence of the cab, listening to the rain pound against the metal roof, trying to process how 40 years of unyielding love and sacrifice had been erased in exactly 5 minutes. I thought the pain could not possibly get any worse. I thought the betrayal was complete. But I was wrong. The true nightmare had not even begun. Just as I finally gathered the strength to put the truck into gear, my cell phone sitting in the cup holder let out a sharp, jarring buzz. I picked it up, wiping the rainwater from the screen with my thumb. It was an automated text message alert from my commercial bank, the bank where I had kept the operating funds for Caldwell antique timepieces for decades. The notification glowed brightly in the dim light of the truck cab. It was an alert for a massive unauthorized wire withdrawal from the business's primary operating account. An amount so staggering it nearly emptied our cash reserves entirely. The money had been transferred to an unknown external holding company. Chloe and Julian had not just locked me out of my building and destroyed my wife's display cases. In the blink of an eye, they had completely drained the financial lifeblood of my legacy. The war had just begun. The drive back to my modest single-story house felt like moving through thick mud. The Lancaster rain battered the windshield of my old truck, but I barely registered the sound. My chest was so incredibly tight, I thought my heart might simply stop beating right there against the steering wheel. I had survived decades of hard labor economic downturns and the agonizing grief of losing my beautiful Sarah, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer physical shock of my own flesh and blood locking me out in the cold. When I parked in my driveway, my arthritic knees screamed as I stepped out into the puddles. I ignored the pain. The only thing echoing in my mind was that terrifying digital alert on my phone. A massive unauthorized withdrawal. Our cash reserves, the financial safety net I had meticulously built dollar by dollar, had been siphoned away in an instant. I walked through my front door and did not bother to take off my wet canvas jacket. I went straight to the small den where I kept my desktop computer. My hands were shaking so severely I could barely type my login credentials into the commercial banking portal. For over 30 years I had managed every penny that flowed through Caldwell antique timepieces. I knew the account numbers by heart. I typed my password, a combination of Sarah's birthday and the year we opened the shop, and pressed the enter key. A bold red error message appeared on the screen. Invalid password. I blinked, convinced my trembling fingers had made a mistake. I carefully typed it again, verifying every single letter and number. I pressed enter, invalid password. I tried the security recovery option, but the system informed me that the primary email address and the recovery phone number associated with the account had been changed just 2 hours prior. I sat back in my desk chair, the cold, wet fabric of my jacket clinging to my back. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a young, overly ambitious couple making a hasty business decision. This was a calculated, deliberate, and highly organized financial hijacking. They had stripped me of my physical access to the building and severed my digital access to the funds I had earned with my own sweat. I felt a suffocating wave of panic. How could Julian do this? How could the boy who used to sit on my workbench and watch me polish brass pendulums sign away our family legacy to a woman he had known for barely 3 years? I grabbed my cell phone from the desk and dialed Julian's private number. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to ask him directly if he understood what was happening. The phone rang 3 times. With every ring, my pulse pounded harder in my ears. Finally, the line clicked open. "Julian," I said, my voice thick with emotion and rising panic. "Son, you need to tell me what is going on with the bank accounts right now." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a sharp, familiar sigh. It was not Julian. Harrison Chloe said, her voice smooth, calm, and dripping with aggressive condescension. "Julian is entirely too busy to speak with you right now. We are dealing with contractors and a massive structural mess at the shop." "Put my son on the phone, Chloe," I demanded, gripping the plastic edge of my desk. "You have absolutely no right to change the banking passwords. I am still the legal founder of that business. Actually, Harrison, you are a minority shareholder. As of the transition documents Julian filed last week," she replied effortlessly, as if she were speaking to a slow child. You really need to calm down. All this unnecessary stress is terrible for your blood pressure. We both know your health has been declining. You should be using this time to rest, perhaps take up a hobby, and simply enjoy your retirement. Do not patronize me, I warned, my voice shaking with a deep, furious rumble. I saw the withdrawal alert. You are bleeding the operating accounts dry. We are reallocating stagnant capital to fund the modernization phase. She countered smoothly, completely unbothered by my anger. It is standard corporate procedure. Julian and I have it completely under control. Do not call this number again to harass my husband, Harrison. If you continue to act this erratically, we will be forced to involve our legal counsel to protect our peace of mind. Have a pleasant afternoon. The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a hollow, mocking sound. She had hung up on me. She had effectively built a fortress around my son and completely severed my communication with him. I was completely isolated in my own home, trapped in a nightmare I could not wake up from. The next few days passed in an agonizing blur of silence and deep depression. I contacted a local lawyer, but he told me that without seeing the transition documents Julian had supposedly filed, my options were severely limited. I needed to speak to my son face to face, away from his controlling wife. I decided to wait until Sunday. For the past 4 years, every single Sunday morning I drove to their upscale suburban neighborhood to make blueberry pancakes for my 6-year-old granddaughter Lily. It was our sacred tradition. Lily was the absolute light of my life. She had Sarah's bright, inquisitive eyes and a laugh that could cure any amount of arthritic pain. I would mix the batter from scratch, let her pour the blueberries, and we would watch Saturday morning cartoons together while Julian and Chloe slept in. I reasoned that Chloe could not possibly block a grandfather from his weekly tradition. I hoped that seeing Lily would give me a chance to pull Julian aside and talk some sense into him. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. I put on my best sweater, bought a fresh basket of blueberries from the local farmer market, and drove to their neighborhood. The houses here were massive, sterile, and perfectly manicured, a stark contrast to my humble lived-in home. I parked my truck by the curb and walked up the long paved driveway. I held the basket of blueberries tightly, my heart fluttering with the hopeful anticipation of seeing Lily run to the door. I rang the doorbell. I waited. Usually I would hear the rapid, joyful thumping of Lily's small feet running across the hardwood floor. Today, there was only silence. I rang the bell again. After a long minute, the heavy front door swung open. Chloe stood in the doorway. She was wearing expensive athletic wear, holding a steaming mug of coffee. Her expression was completely devoid of any warmth. She did not open the screen door to let me in. "What are you doing here, Harrison?" she asked flatly, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "It is Sunday morning, Chloe," I said, trying to keep my voice as steady and polite as possible. "I am here to make pancakes with Lily. It is our tradition. Please let me come in." Chloe shook her head slowly, looking at me with an expression of profound pity that made my stomach churn. "I am afraid that is no longer going to work for us," she said. "Lily is extremely busy today. She has an advanced reading tutor coming in an hour, and then she has private violin lessons. She is 6 years old," I pleaded, gripping the handle of the blueberry basket. "She does not need private tutors on a Sunday morning. She needs her grandfather. Let me just see her for 10 minutes. Let me give her these blueberries." "Your presence is highly disruptive to her new routine, Harrison," Chloe replied, her tone turning sharply defensive and cold. "Children need strict structure, not chaotic emotional visits from people who refuse to respect boundaries. Julian and I have agreed that it is best if you give us some serious space right now. Your behavior at the shop on Tuesday was incredibly alarming. We cannot have that kind of unstable energy around our daughter." "My behavior?" I asked, my voice rising in utter disbelief. "You destroyed her grandmother's display cases and locked me out of my own business. Keep your voice down, Chloe warned, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. I will not tolerate you screaming on my front porch. If you do not leave this property immediately, I will call the police and report you for trespassing. Do you really want Lily to see her grandfather being escorted away in the back of a police cruiser? The threat hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She was using my precious granddaughter as a weapon. She was holding Lily hostage to force my absolute compliance. I looked past Chloe's shoulder, peering into the deep shadows of the house. Standing at the top of the carpeted staircase, I saw a small figure. It was Lily. She was clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, looking down at me with wide, confused, and deeply sorrowful eyes. She raised a small hand and gave me a tiny, hesitant wave. My heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I wanted to push past the screen door, run up those stairs, and hold her in my arms. But I knew exactly what Chloe was capable of. If I caused a scene, she would use it to legally bar me from ever seeing Lily again. She would paint me as a violent, unstable old man. I had to protect my granddaughter from that trauma. I looked at Lily, forced the warmest, most reassuring smile I could muster, and waved back. Then I looked at Chloe. The absolute malice in her eyes was chilling. She smiled triumphantly, knowing she had won this battle. She slowly closed the heavy front door, the click of the lock sounding like a prison cell slamming shut. I stood on the porch for a long time, the basket of fresh blueberries feeling incredibly heavy in my tired hands. The morning sun offered no warmth. I felt completely defeated, stripped of my business, my son, and my only grandchild in a matter of 5 days. I slowly walked back down the long driveway, each step a monument to my agonizing grief. I climbed into the cab of my old truck, tossed the blueberries onto the passenger seat, and simply sat there. I did not start the engine. I could not bring myself to drive away just yet. I parked directly across the street from their house, hidden beneath the shade of a large oak tree. I watched the front windows, hoping to catch one more fleeting glimpse of Lily. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of absolute wealthy silence where secrets are easily buried behind perfectly manicured lawns. I sat there for nearly an hour, lost in a dark spiral of self-doubt and misery. I wondered if I truly was an obsolete, foolish old man. I wondered if Sarah would be ashamed of me for losing everything we had built. But then the quiet suburban street was interrupted by the low, powerful purr of an expensive engine. I looked in my rearview mirror. A sleek, midnight black luxury sports car turned onto the street. It was a vehicle that cost more than my entire house. It glided smoothly down the road and pulled directly into Julian and Chloe's driveway, parking right behind Chloe's imported SUV. I frowned, leaning slightly forward over my steering wheel. I knew for a fact that Julian was completely oblivious to cars like that. He drove a sensible sedan and cared very little for flashy status symbols. And Chloe had explicitly told me just an hour ago that Julian was inside the house, busy preparing for Lily's tutoring sessions. The driver's side door of the sports car opened. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped out onto the pristine driveway. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was slicked back, and his leather shoes shone brilliantly in the morning light. He moved with an arrogant, deeply confident swagger. He did not walk to the front door and ring the bell. He walked directly to the side garage door, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Before he could even reach the handle, the side door opened. Chloe stepped out into the garage. She was no longer wearing the casual athletic clothes she had on when she threatened to call the police on me. She was wearing a stunning, form-fitting dress, her hair perfectly styled, looking like she was ready for a high-end corporate gala. I watched in absolute paralyzed shock as the strange man smiled warmly at my daughter-in-law. He did not offer a handshake. He reached out, placed a familiar, intimate hand on the small of her back, and pulled her close. Chloe leaned in, tilted her head, and kissed him deeply on the cheek. She laughed a bright, melodic sound that I could hear all the way from my truck, a sound she never made when my son Julian was in the room. The man handed her a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. She took it eagerly, her eyes gleaming with an intense, calculating excitement. They exchanged a few more quiet words, sharing a knowing, secretive smile, and then quickly stepped inside the house together, pulling the door shut behind them. I sat in my truck, the air suddenly growing thin and cold in my lungs. My mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. The massive, unexplained withdrawal from the business operating accounts. The mysterious corporate entity draining our cash. The sudden, violent destruction of the shop interior. The brutal isolation of my son, and the weaponization of my granddaughter. And now this strange, wealthy man walking into their home with an intimate familiarity, while my son was supposedly inside. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me completely, erasing the grief and depression that had crippled me all morning. This was not about modernizing an antique clock shop. This was not about a daughter-in-law who simply disliked her old-fashioned father-in-law. The financial anomaly, and this strange, deeply suspicious man, triggered my absolute deepest instincts. They were stealing my legacy, and they were playing my gentle, trusting son for an absolute fool. I did not know exactly what they were planning behind those closed doors, but as I started my truck engine, my hand stopped trembling. I was no longer a defeated, obsolete old man. I was a father who had just witnessed the wolf entering his son's house. And I swore to the memory of my late wife that I would tear their entire deceptive world apart piece by piece to find the truth. I did not sit in my truck and cry. Tears are for men who have accepted defeat, and I was far from finished. I turned the ignition key, the familiar rumble of my old engine grounding me in the present reality. I drove straight away from that pristine suburban street and headed directly into the heart of downtown Lancaster. I did not go to the police. I had no solid proof yet, only the sharp, undeniable instinct of a man who had survived 40 years in the demanding world of antique restoration. I needed hard facts. I needed numbers on a page. I steered my truck toward the First Fidelity Bank branch on King Street. This was the same bank where my late wife Sarah and I had opened our very first commercial checking account 4 decades ago. We had walked through those heavy glass doors as a young, anxious couple with nothing but a modest loan and a grand vision. For my entire career, I took immense pride in keeping a perfectly balanced ledger. I paid every supplier on time. I never bounced a single check. That spotless financial reputation was the bedrock of Caldwell antique timepieces. I walked into the quiet, carpeted lobby of the bank. The air smelled of polished brass and fresh coffee. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly to the glass-walled office at the back. Martha Higgins sat behind her desk. Martha had been the branch manager for 20 years. We had watched each other grow old. I had crafted a beautiful walnut mantel clock for her 25th wedding anniversary. She looked up from her computer screen, her warm smile faltering the moment she saw the grim, hardened expression on my face. I sat down in the chair across from her and did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Martha that I needed a complete, detailed printout of the transaction history for the shop operating account for the past 60 days. Martha looked deeply uncomfortable. She folded her hands on her desk and softly explained that Julian had come into the branch the previous week. He had presented new corporate resolution documents, signed and notarized, effectively transferring the primary administrative banking privileges entirely to himself and his wife, Chloe. Martha gently told me that my digital access had been completely revoked, and she technically lacked the authorization to hand me the current statements. I looked Martha directly in the eyes. I leaned forward, resting my aching, calloused hands on her desk. I told her that I understood the new documents, but I also reminded her of the foundational incorporation papers filed in 1984. Those original documents established me as the primary founder and perpetual guarantor of the business entity. Regardless of whatever modern administrative changes Chloe had pushed through, my legal name and my social security number were still permanently anchored to the bedrock of that commercial account. I was still legally liable for its debts. I told Martha with a quiet, desperate intensity that I believed my son was being manipulated and that my life legacy was being stolen out from under me. Martha stared at me for a long, silent moment. She looked at my hands scarred from decades of shaping metal and polishing wood. She sighed heavily, a look of profound sympathy crossing her face. She told me she was going to bend the rules just this once because she knew the kind of honest man I was. She turned to her computer, typed rapidly for a few moments, and sent a command to her private printer. The machine hummed and pushed out 5 pages of financial records. Martha handed them to me across the desk. Her hand lingered on the paper for a second, and she offered a quiet warning to prepare myself for what I was about to see. I took the pages. My eyes scanned the lines of black ink. The shock that hit me was entirely physical. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed out of the small office. The business was not just being modernized, as Chloe had so arrogantly claimed. It was being systematically and ruthlessly bled dry. There were massive, continuous outbound wire transfers, $10,000 on a Tuesday, $15,000 the following Monday, $25,000 just 3 days ago. Every single one of these massive withdrawals was funneled directly into an external account registered to a mysterious limited liability company called Apex Horizon. I had never heard of this company in my life. Caldwell Antique Timepieces had absolutely no vendors partners or service providers by that name. Our cash reserves, carefully built over a lifetime of meticulous saving to ensure the shop could survive any economic downturn, were evaporating into thin air. But the sheer volume of the stolen money was only the first layer of the devastation. I looked further down the ledger, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There were multiple missed payment fees. There were stop payment alerts on outgoing checks. I saw the names of my oldest, most trusted suppliers listed beside glaring red denial codes. There was a bounced check to Elias Thornton, an elderly brass founder in Philadelphia, who custom machined the intricate escapement gears for our 18th century restorations. There was a denied payment to a specialty lumber mill in Boston that provided the rare, aged mahogany we used for cabinet repairs. These were good, honest men who had trusted my word and my credit for over 30 years. Chloe and Julian had stopped paying the very people who kept the shop alive. They were taking the money that belonged to my vendors and pouring it straight into the black hole of Apex Horizon. They were destroying my flawless 40-year reputation in a matter of weeks. I felt a hot, blinding wave of righteous anger course through my veins. The betrayal was complete and absolute. They were not just stealing money. They were destroying the name Caldwell in the antique trade. I asked Martha to stamp the pages with the official bank seal to certify their authenticity. I thanked her for her loyalty, folded the heavy pages and placed them securely inside my jacket pocket. I did not go home. I drove to a nearby diner, ordered a black coffee, and sat in a quiet booth for hours. I waited for the sun to set. I needed the element of surprise. I needed to confront my son when the shield of daylight and public spaces was stripped away. I needed to look him in the eye and show him the undeniable proof of his wife's financial slaughter. By 7 o'clock that evening, the rain had finally stopped, but the damp, biting chill remained in the Pennsylvania air. I drove back to Julian and Chloe's upscale suburban neighborhood. The street was quiet, illuminated by soft, glowing street lamps. I parked my truck directly in their driveway, right behind Julian's sensible sedan. The sleek, midnight black luxury sports car I had seen earlier that morning was gone. I walked up to the heavy front door and knocked firmly. I did not ring the bell. I knocked with the heavy rhythmic thud of a father demanding answers. A moment later, the door swung open. Julian stood there, wearing casual evening clothes. The smell of roasted garlic and expensive wine drifted out from the kitchen. When he saw my face, the remaining color drained entirely from his cheeks. He instinctively took a step backward, his eyes darting down the hallway as if looking for an escape route. I did not wait for an invitation. I stepped across the threshold, forcing Julian to back up into the foyer. I told him we were going to talk, and we were going to talk right now. Julian stammered, raising his hands in a weak, defensive posture. He told me it was late, and that Chloe was upstairs putting Lily to bed. He begged me not to start another argument, claiming his nerves were completely fried from the stress of the shop renovations. I ignored his pathetic excuses. I walked straight past him, my heavy boots thudding against their pristine hardwood floors, and marched directly into their massive, brightly lit kitchen. Julian scurried after me like a frightened child. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the certified bank statements, and slammed them down onto the polished granite island. The sharp smack of my hand against the stone echoed loudly through the quiet house. I pointed a trembling, calloused finger at the papers. I commanded my son to look at the ledger. I demanded he explain why the cash reserves his mother and I had killed ourselves to build were being liquidated. I demanded he tell me why my oldest, most loyal friends in the antique trade were receiving bounced checks bearing the Caldwell name. Julian slowly approached the kitchen island. He looked down at the highlighted lines of text. His eyes widened in genuine, unfiltered shock. I watched his face carefully. I could see his mind struggling to process the numbers. The deep confusion and sudden terror in his eyes told me one very important thing. He did not know the full extent of the financial drain. He was a pawn. He picked up the pages, his hands shaking, just as mine had earlier that day. He read the name Apex Horizon aloud, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at me completely bewildered. He swore to me that he had no idea the withdrawals were this massive. He said he had only authorized a small budget for initial marketing research. He stammered that Chloe was handling the accounts payable while he focused on clearing out the physical inventory. Before I could press him further, the sharp, confident click of high heels sounded on the wooden stairs. Chloe glided into the kitchen. She wore a silk evening robe, looking completely relaxed and untouched by the tension suffocating the room. She looked at the papers in Julian's trembling hands, and then she looked at me. She did not panic. She did not display an ounce of guilt or fear. Instead, a cold, expertly calculated smile spread across her face. She walked smoothly to Julian's side and placed a comforting, dominant hand on his shoulder. She looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. She asked me why I was harassing her husband with stolen bank documents in the middle of the night. I did not back down. I told her I knew exactly what she was doing. I told her the business was being looted. I pointed at the name Apex Horizon on the paper and demanded to know who she was funneling our family money to. Chloe let out a soft, condescending laugh. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She turned to Julian, rubbing his arm soothingly, and spoke to him as if I were a confused, deeply unstable patient. She smoothly explained that Apex Horizon was a premier modern digital branding agency based out of Philadelphia. She claimed they had retained the firm to completely overhaul the shop's outdated image. She spun a complex, highly convincing web of corporate jargon. She talked about search engine optimization, targeted social media demographics, and comprehensive brand identity restructuring. She stated that the large wire transfers were standard retainer fees for a high-end agency. As for the unpaid suppliers, Chloe waved her hand dismissively. She claimed she had intentionally frozen payments to those outdated vendors because they were going to sever ties with the old expensive suppliers anyway. She insisted they were transitioning to cheaper wholesale distributors to increase profit margins. She looked at Julian with wide, innocent eyes and told him she was simply executing the aggressive business plan they had agreed upon to save the failing shop. I slammed my fist on the granite counter. I shouted that she was lying through her teeth. I yelled that you do not bounce checks to honest men just to change suppliers. I told Julian to open his eyes, reminding him of the strange, wealthy man I had seen pulling into his driveway that very morning while he was away. The moment I mentioned the man in the sports car, a microsecond of genuine panic finally flashed across Chloe's perfectly composed face, but she recovered with terrifying speed. She gasped, bringing a hand to her chest, and looked at Julian with an expression of profound, wounded betrayal. She told Julian that my dementia was escalating into paranoid delusions. She claimed the man in the sports car was just a neighborhood contractor, giving her an estimate for a new garage door. She spun the narrative, instantly transforming my factual observation into the raving hallucination of a sick, jealous old man trying to destroy their marriage. I looked at my son. I pleaded with him. I told him to look at the numbers, to trust the father who had raised him, not the woman who was isolating him from his family. But Julian was weak. He looked at the bank statements, then looked at his beautiful, weeping wife. The thought of his marriage crumbling, the thought of facing a massive conflict was simply too terrifying for him to bear. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose the comfortable lie over the agonizing truth. Julian threw the bank statements back onto the granite island. He squared his shoulders, trying to muster a false sense of authority. He looked at me, his eyes completely closed off, dead to our shared history. He told me that Chloe was right. He said my behavior was completely out of control and that my paranoid accusations were insulting to his wife. He stated firmly that Apex Horizon was a legitimate marketing expense and that I simply could not comprehend modern business practices. Then my own son pointed a trembling finger toward the front door. He told me to get out of his house. He warned me that if I ever came back waving stolen financial documents and accusing his wife of infidelity, he would personally file the restraining order against me. The heartbreak was absolute. I was looking at a man who wore my face, but who possessed none of my spirit. He had surrendered his entire will to a master manipulator. I picked up my copies of the bank statements, folding them carefully, and returning them to my jacket pocket. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear in front of them. I looked at Chloe, who was smirking triumphantly over Julian's shoulder. I looked at my son one last time, a profound sorrow weighing down my soul. I told him that a man who refuses to see the truth will eventually be buried by it. I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the hallway, stepping out into the cold, unforgiving night. I was completely alone, but I was no longer confused. The battle lines were drawn, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. The morning after I was thrown out of my own son's house, I woke up feeling as though my entire body had been beaten with a heavy wooden mallet. Every single joint in my 68-year-old frame ached with a dull and throbbing intensity. But the physical pain radiating through my arthritic knees and hands was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing, suffocating weight sitting squarely on my chest. I made a pot of black coffee out of pure, mindless habit, but I could not bring myself to drink a single drop of it. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, staring blankly out the window at the gray Pennsylvania sky. I replayed the agonizing events of the previous night over and over again in my mind. I saw Julian pointing a trembling, cowardly finger at me, ordering me to leave. I saw Chloe smiling with that cold, triumphant smirk, resting her hand on his shoulder like a puppeteer controlling a broken toy. I felt a profound, devastating sense of failure. I did not feel like a failed businessman. I felt like a failed father. I had raised my son to be an honest man, to respect the value of a hard day of work, and above all else to protect his family. Yet there he stood, cowering behind a manipulative woman who was actively and ruthlessly dismantling our entire lives. Around 10 o'clock that morning, the harsh buzz of my front doorbell shattered the heavy silence of my house. I walked slowly to the door, a small, foolish part of my heart, hoping it might be Julian coming to apologize. I hoped the clear light of day had finally broken through whatever dark spell Chloe had cast over him. Instead, I opened the door to find a stone-faced courier standing on my porch. He handed me a thick, stiff cardboard envelope, asked for my signature on an electronic pad, and quickly walked away down my driveway. I looked down at the return address, printed neatly in the corner. It was from a high-end corporate law firm located in the most expensive financial district of downtown Philadelphia. My hands, still stiff and burning with arthritis, fumbled clumsily as I tore open the heavy paper flap. Inside were 4 pages of dense, threatening legal jargon printed on crisp, expensive watermarked paper. It was a formal cease and desist order. I walked back into my kitchen, sat down heavily at the table, and forced my tired eyes to read every single word. The sheer cruelty of what was written on those pages made my blood run entirely cold. The letter, drafted by a slick, expensive attorney representing the new corporate entity of Caldwell Antique Timepieces, painted a picture of me that was so distorted and grotesque I could barely recognize my own name. The lawyer claimed that over the past 6 months, I had been exhibiting severe and rapidly escalating signs of cognitive decline and aggressive dementia. The legal document stated that my sudden appearance at Julian's home the night before was a terrifying paranoid episode. They classified my legitimate fact-based questions regarding the massive withdrawals from our commercial bank accounts as the delusional, fabricated ravings of a sick and unstable man. Chloe had completely flipped the narrative. She had taken my righteous anger over her financial theft and legally documented it as a mental breakdown. But the gaslighting did not stop at simply attacking my mental sanity. The letter went on to explicitly accuse me of repeatedly harassing the new management team. It falsely claimed my emotional outbursts were actively disrupting the modernization of the business and creating a dangerous, hostile work environment for the contractors they had hired. Then came the final devastating blow that nearly brought me to my knees. The attorney stated in absolute, unequivocal terms that if I set foot within 500 feet of the shop, or if I attempted to contact my son or my granddaughter Lily without prior written authorization, they would immediately file for a permanent restraining order against me. The letter promised that local law enforcement would be involved and that they would submit sworn statements detailing my erratic behavior to ensure I was kept away from my granddaughter permanently. They were not just stealing my life savings and the shop I had built from the ground up. They were legally erasing me from my own family. They were weaponizing the law, a system meant to protect innocent people, using it as a blunt instrument to bludgeon me into silent, terrified submission. They knew I loved Lily more than life itself. They knew that the mere threat of losing access to her would paralyze me with fear. I let the heavy pages slip from my trembling fingers. They scattered across the kitchen table, a stark white contrast against the worn oak wood. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, my absolute resolve finally shattered. I buried my face in my rough, calloused hands, and I wept. I cried with the agonizing chest, heaving sorrow of a father who suddenly realizes he has lost his only child to a darkness he cannot fight. The realization hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. Julian was either entirely complicit in this monstrous financial scheme, or he was so completely blinded, so entirely broken and dominated by his controlling wife that he was willing to let her destroy his own father just to keep a false sense of peace in his house. I did not know which reality was worse. How could the boy who used to fall asleep to the gentle ticking of pocket watches in my workshop allow this to happen? How could he stand by and watch his wife threaten to use his own daughter, my precious Lily, as a legal bargaining chip? The psychological violence of the cease and desist letter was deliberately designed to paralyze me with overwhelming fear. It was engineered to make me doubt my own sanity, to force me to curl up in a quiet corner and simply fade away into the shadows of my old age. I stood up from the kitchen table, my breath hitching painfully in my throat, and walked slowly into my quiet living room. Above the stone fireplace sat a silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Sarah. The picture was taken on our 30th wedding anniversary. She was smiling that bright, beautiful, forgiving smile that could effortlessly light up the darkest, dustiest corners of our antique shop. I reached out with a trembling hand and gently traced the edge of the cold silver frame with my thumb. I remembered the early days when we had absolutely nothing to our names. I remembered eating cheap canned soup for dinner while we saved every single spare penny to buy our first set of professional watchmaker tools. I remembered Sarah staying up until 2 a.m, meticulously polishing intricate brass fittings until her fingers bled while I repaired broken gear trains under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp. We were both exhausted, but we were so incredibly happy because we were building a secure, debt-free future for our family. Looking deep into her printed eyes, the suffocating despair that had been drowning me all morning began to harden into something entirely different. The sorrow morphed into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I spoke out loud to the empty room, my voice steadying and deepening with every single word. I promised Sarah that I would not let our entire life work be destroyed by a greedy, manipulative woman and a cowardly son. I promised her that I would fight for our legacy and for our granddaughter, even if it took the very last breath in my lungs. I swore to her that I would not go quietly into the night just because a slick corporate lawyer sent me a threatening piece of paper. But standing there staring back at the scattered legal documents on my kitchen table, I knew that righteous anger and stubborn pride were simply not enough. Chloe was incredibly smart. She had complete control of the commercial bank accounts. She had expensive legal representation securing her moves. She was already establishing a credible paper trail that successfully painted me as a legally incompetent, aggressive threat to her family. If I went to the police right now, it would be my desperate word against her highly paid attorneys. I had absolutely no concrete, admissible proof of her affair with the wealthy man in the luxury sports car. I had no definitive proof of her scheme to liquidate the business for her own personal gain. The bank statements I had obtained were alarming, but Chloe had already provided Julian with a semi-plausible excuse about modern marketing retainers and rebranding efforts. I needed undeniable, absolute proof. I needed to know exactly what she was saying and planning when I was not in the room. I needed to capture the secretive conversations she was having with that strange man when Julian was conveniently scheduled to be out of the house. I sat down heavily in my worn leather armchair, closing my eyes tight, mentally walking through every single inch of my antique shop. I thought about the physical layout of the building, the reinforced walls, the antique furniture that the contractors had not yet smashed into kindling with their sledgehammers. And then a sudden, brilliant flash of memory illuminated my mind like a lighthouse cutting through a dense fog. I thought of the absolute centerpiece of Caldwell antique timepieces. It was the one specific item Chloe had explicitly ordered the rough contractors to leave entirely untouched. She had demanded they protect it because she believed its sheer aesthetic majesty and historical value would attract the high-end, wealthy modern clientele she so desperately craved. It was a massive, absolutely breathtaking 18th century French grandfather clock. I had personally spent 3 grueling, meticulous years restoring that masterpiece to its original glory. I knew every single brass gear, every polished wooden panel, and every hidden iron screw in its towering 9-foot frame. But far more importantly, I remembered a very specific, undocumented detail about its original construction. Built directly into the heavy, solid oak base of that ancient clock was a secret, completely hollow compartment. It was masterfully designed centuries ago by European craftsmen to hide valuable family jewels and gold coins from invading thieves. The mechanical latch to open this compartment was entirely hidden within the decorative trim. It required a highly precise, simultaneous sequence of physical pressures on the wooden molding that only a seasoned master horologist would ever recognize or comprehend. Julian did not know about the compartment. Chloe certainly did not know about it. It was a perfectly concealed dark void resting right in the absolute center of the main office area, where she was now conducting all of her illicit business. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs with a dangerous, thrilling new plan. If I could not fight them in the open courtroom today, I would fight them from the quiet shadows tonight. I needed to drive to an electronics store and purchase a voice-activated digital audio recorder. I needed to find a way to get back inside that shop under the cover of darkness, completely bypass the new electronic locks they had installed, and turn my greatest restored masterpiece into a silent, ticking spy. I did not waste a single second after I made my decision to fight back. I drove straight to a large electronics store on the far side of town, away from my usual neighborhoods, so no one would recognize me. I walked down the bright, noisy aisles until I found exactly what I was looking for. I purchased a small, high-tech digital audio recorder. It was a sleek, black device, no larger than a matchbox. The packaging boasted that it was voice-activated, meaning it would only record when someone was actively speaking in the room. This was crucial, as it would save battery life and allow the device to sit completely undetected for weeks if necessary. I paid for the device entirely in cash. I did not want a single paper trail connecting me to this purchase. I walked back to my truck, sat in the driver's seat, and meticulously tore open the plastic packaging. I read the small instruction manual twice over, making absolutely sure I understood every single function. I tested the microphone by speaking softly into the dark cab of my truck. When I played the audio back, my voice sounded foreign to me. It was rough-aged and exhausted, but underneath the weariness I heard the undeniable, hardened steel of a father who was finally ready to go to war. I drove back to my quiet house and waited for the sun to go down. The hours dragged on like heavy iron chains. I paced my living room floor, staring at the silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Sarah. I asked her for strength and guidance. I knew that what I was about to do was incredibly risky. It bordered on reckless. If Chloe caught me inside that shop, she would use that exact moment as the final absolute nail in my coffin. She would immediately call the police and show them a broken-down old man breaking into a commercial building he no longer legally controlled. She would enthusiastically brand me a trespasser, suffering from severe, dangerous dementia. The slick corporate lawyer she had hired would easily convince a judge that I was a threat to myself and others. I would lose the shop forever. My reputation would be entirely destroyed, and all access to my precious granddaughter Lily would be permanently revoked by a court order. The stakes were impossibly high. But doing absolutely nothing, surrendering my family legacy to a manipulator, was simply not an option I could live with. When the antique grandfather clock in my hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning, I knew it was time. I put on my dark canvas work jacket, pulled a dark wool beanie over my gray hair, and grabbed a heavy iron flashlight from my toolbox. The night was pitch black. The freezing rain from the previous days had finally stopped, but it had left behind a biting, bone-chilling wind that whipped fiercely through the quiet, sleeping streets of Lancaster. Every single joint in my body protested as I stepped out into the cold. My arthritic knees screamed in sharp agony as I climbed into the cab of my truck, but I pushed the physical pain deep down into my gut. I drove with my headlights dimmed as I neared the downtown historic district. I parked 2 blocks away from Caldwell antique timepieces, hiding my truck in a dark residential lot. I did not want my vehicle anywhere near the building. I walked the rest of the way on foot, slipping through the narrow cobblestone alleyways that I knew like the absolute back of my hand. I had walked these alleys for 40 years. I knew every shadow, every brick, and every hiding place. I carefully approached the rear of the shop. I could see that the heavy back door was now equipped with a brand new, glowing electronic keypad lock. Chloe had made absolutely sure my old brass keys were entirely useless. But there was one critical thing Chloe did not know about the building she was trying to steal. And more importantly, there was one thing even my son Julian did not know. When Sarah and I first bought the historic building 4 decades ago, there was an old, severely rusted iron storm hatch buried under a thick patch of overgrown ivy in the back alley. It led directly down into the original stone-lined root cellar of the property. We had sealed the cellar off from the main basement tightly decades ago because it was incredibly prone to dampness and flooding, rendering it useless for storing delicate antique clocks. However, I had secretly kept the rusted padlock oiled and the heavy iron hinges meticulously maintained just in case of a severe emergency. I had never told anyone about it. It was my secret doorway. I knelt on the cold, wet cobblestones of the alley. The damp winter chill seeped straight through my denim jeans, sending fiery spikes of arthritis radiating up my thighs and into my hips. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to ignore the excruciating agony. I reached into the dark shadows and pulled away the thick vines of dead, wet ivy, until my fingers found the heavy iron ring of the storm hatch. I slipped a small, vintage skeleton key from my deepest pocket. It was a key I had kept completely separate from my master ring for 40 years. I slid the key into the old brass padlock. It clicked open with a deeply satisfying, heavy, mechanical thud. I grabbed the iron ring with both hands and pulled upward with all my might. My shoulders burned and my chest heaved with the immense effort. But finally, the rusted iron door creaked open just enough for me to slip my body inside. I carefully descended the crumbling, uneven stone steps into the pitch-black cellar. The air down there was suffocating. It smelled strongly of wet earth-old stone and centuries of forgotten history. I navigated the tight, dangerous space purely by memory, keeping my flashlight entirely turned off, so no stray beam of light would bleed through the floorboards into the alley above. I walked slowly, my hands trailing along the damp stone walls to keep my balance. Finally, I reached the heavy wooden trap door in the ceiling that connected the cellar directly to the main back room of the shop. I unlatched it and pushed it upward very slowly, wincing sharply at every tiny, agonizing squeak the old wood made. When I finally climbed up into the main shop and secured the trapdoor beneath my feet, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. I clicked on my flashlight, covering the wide lens with my fingers, so only a thin, targeted sliver of light escaped into the room. What I saw in that dim illumination broke my heart all over again. The warm, rich mahogany walls that Sarah had painstakingly polished by hand were completely gone. The historic textured wallpaper had been violently torn down and scrapped. The entire space had been painted a sterile, blinding hospital white. The beautiful hand-carved wooden display cases that held my life work had been entirely ripped out and replaced by cheap hollow metal racks and harsh neon lighting fixtures. It looked like a cold, soulless modern art gallery. It looked absolutely nothing like the home I had built. Decades of my family history, my wife's gentle touch and my own sweat had been brutally erased, painted over and thrown into an industrial dumpster in a matter of days. Hot tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I fiercely blinked them away. I forced myself to focus on the mission. I was not there to mourn the loss of wood and paint. I was there to plant a silent spy. I swept my narrow beam of light across the barren, newly tiled floor until I finally found it. Standing tall, elegant, and entirely defiant in the very center of what was now Chloe's main office area was the magnificent 18th century French grandfather clock. They had left it exactly where I had placed it years ago. It was the only original piece remaining in the room. Chloe clearly thought it was just an expensive, decorative prop to impress her wealthy modern demographic. She had absolutely no idea what secrets that clock held within its ancient timber. I walked quietly up to the towering 9-foot masterpiece. The polished dark walnut wood gleamed faintly in the sliver of light from my flashlight. I ran my trembling hands over the intricate hand-chiseled carvings, feeling the deeply familiar grooves and polished brass fittings I had restored with my own hands over 3 painstaking years. I slowly sank to my knees at the heavy, solid oak base of the clock. My joints popped loudly in the dead silence of the room, a stark reminder of my age. I took a deep, steadying breath and ran my fingers along the bottom edge of the decorative trim. I felt for the hidden pressure points. This clock had been masterfully designed centuries ago by European craftsmen to hide valuable family jewels and gold coins from invading thieves. The mechanical latch to open the secret compartment was entirely hidden within the wood grain itself. It required a highly precise, simultaneous sequence of physical pressures that only a seasoned master horologist would ever recognize or comprehend. I pressed my thumbs firmly into the specific spots on the molding, applying exact simultaneous pressure, just as the original craftsman had intended. With a soft, barely audible metallic click, a hidden panel in the solid oak base popped open, revealing a dark, hollow void inside. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the voice-activated digital recorder. I turned the small power switch on, ensuring the tiny red indicator light was functioning perfectly. I carefully placed the device deep inside the dark, hollow compartment. I used a piece of heavy, double-sided tape I had brought with me to secure the plastic device firmly to the wooden floor of the hidden space, ensuring it would not rattle or shift and accidentally give away its location. The secret compartment was located directly below where Chloe had set up her massive new modern glass desk. It was the absolute perfect location. Every single word spoken in that office, every arrogant command, every secret phone call, and every hushed conspiratorial conversation with the wealthy man in the luxury sports car would be perfectly and flawlessly captured by the sensitive microphone. I took one last look at the small red light blinking in the darkness, and then I gently pushed the solid oak panel back into place. It locked with a seamless, entirely invisible fit. The massive grandfather clock continued its steady rhythmic ticking, standing tall as a silent, unwavering guardian of my legacy. The trap was set. My mission was complete. But I knew the absolute hardest part was getting out of the building without being seen. I slowly retreated to the back room, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs like a trapped, desperate bird. I climbed back down through the trap door into the pitch-black cellar, securing the wooden latch tightly above me. I navigated the dark, damp space, my hands brushing the wet stone, and climbed the crumbling steps back out into the freezing alleyway. I pulled the heavy iron storm hatch closed, the freezing metal biting painfully into my bare, cold hands. I snapped the old brass padlock shut, and carefully dragged the thick, dead ivy vines back over the iron ring, meticulously arranging the leaves to perfectly conceal the entrance once again. I stood up, brushing the wet dirt and dead leaves from my aching knees. I took a deep, shaking breath of the frigid night air, feeling a sudden massive rush of triumphant adrenaline. I had done it. I had breached their fortress. But that fleeting feeling of triumph was instantly and violently shattered. Before I could even take a single step toward the main street to begin my walk back to the truck, a harsh, blinding beam of bright white light suddenly swept across the wet brick wall at the far end of the alley. I froze completely, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. The slow creeping crunch of heavy rubber tires rolling over loose gravel echoed loudly in the narrow, echoing space. It was a private security patrol car. It was the kind of heavily armed security hired to monitor the affluent commercial districts downtown. The vehicle was slowly making its way down the narrow alley, its extremely bright roof-mounted spotlight scanning every single back door, every window, and every dark shadow. I was completely trapped. I had absolutely nowhere to run. If I sprinted for the open street, the powerful spotlight would catch me instantly. If I was caught sneaking around the back entrance of Caldwell Antique Timepieces at 2 o'clock in the morning, everything I had just risked my life for would be completely lost. Chloe's slick, aggressive corporate lawyer would have the exact ammunition he needed to destroy me. The official police report would explicitly state that a confused, hostile, and erratic old man was caught prowling behind a business he had just been legally barred from entering. The false narrative of my severe dementia and dangerous paranoia would be cemented in legal stone. I would be locked away in a state-run facility against my will, and my son Julian would be left completely defenseless against his monster of a wife. Pure, suffocating panic seized my throat, but my deepest survival instinct took over. I threw my aged body violently sideways, diving hard behind a massive, foul-smelling industrial dumpster, just as the sweeping beam of the spotlight cut through the exact spot where I had been standing a fraction of a second before. I landed hard on the wet pavement. I pressed my back fiercely against the cold, freezing brick wall of the alley, pulling my knees up tight to my chest to make myself as small as physically possible. The rusted, jagged metal of the dumpster dug painfully into my shoulder through my canvas jacket. I squeezed my eyes shut tight and held my breath, absolutely terrified that the simple, ragged sound of my own wheezing, exhausted lungs would give my position away to the security guard. The patrol car crawled closer. The sound of the engine was deafening in the narrow alley. The blinding white light from the spotlight spilled over the top edge of the metal dumpster, illuminating the pouring rain in harsh, chaotic, terrifying flashes. I could hear the low, rumbling vibration of the car engine idling right in front of my hiding spot. I prayed silently in the darkness. I begged the memory of Sarah to hide me, to blind the guard just long enough for the car to move on. The physical agony in my cramped joints was blinding a searing fire in my knees and hips, but I did not dare move a single, solitary muscle. My heart pounded so violently in my chest, I felt it echoing against the wet brick wall behind me. The security vehicle idled there for what felt like an absolute eternity. The seconds stretched into agonizing, unbearable minutes. I closed my eyes and visualized the tiny digital recorder sitting silently inside the grandfather clock, waiting patiently to capture the truth. I could not fail now. I had to survive this night so I could expose them. Finally, with a loud, aggressive crunch of gravel, the patrol car accelerated. The terrifying engine noise slowly faded away as the vehicle turned out of the alley and disappeared onto the main commercial street. The sweeping, blinding spotlight vanished, leaving me entirely alone in the comforting, beautiful, absolute darkness of the alley. I exhaled a long, violently shaking breath, leaning the back of my head against the wet bricks. My entire body was trembling uncontrollably from the adrenaline and the freezing cold, but I had made it. I slowly stood up my legs, feeling like heavy lead weights, and began the long, agonizing walk back to where my truck was hidden. I drove home through the completely empty, rain-slicked streets of Lancaster, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of shifting power. Chloe thought she had buried me. She thought I was just a weak, obsolete old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows of my own depression. But she had no idea that I had just planted a ticking time bomb directly under her feet. All I had to do now was wait for her to speak. 2 agonizing weeks passed slowly since that terrifying night in the dark alleyway. They were 14 days of absolute, deafening silence. Every single morning, I woke up long before dawn, the bitter cold of my empty house matching the heavy dread settling deep in my aging bones. I drank my black coffee while staring blankly at the kitchen wall, imagining that small digital recording device resting silently in the dark belly of the 18th century French grandfather clock. I pictured it recording every treacherous word, capturing the slow and methodical destruction of my life work. It took every single ounce of restraint in my 68-year-old body not to march down to the shop, shatter the front glass, and demand my son wake up to reality. But I knew the extreme stakes of this invisible war. I knew Chloe was waiting like a spider for me to make one wrong move, one emotional mistake, so she could spring her legal trap. I had to play the part of the defeated, fading old man. I stayed completely away from the downtown district. I tended to the small winter garden behind my house. I fixed a broken iron hinge on my back gate. I did absolutely everything I could to keep my arthritic hands busy because my mind was constantly racing back to my son Julian and my precious granddaughter Lily. I missed them with a physical burning ache that radiated through my chest every hour of the day. I missed the comforting smell of sawdust, brass polish, and machine oil. But most of all, I missed Lily and her bright, ringing laughter filling my quiet Sunday mornings. Finally, after 2 weeks of total and suffocating isolation, my cell phone chimed with a harsh, brief text message. It was from Chloe. The message was cold, entirely clinical, and dictated strict terms as if she were a maximum security prison warden granting a heavily monitored parole visit. She informed me that I was permitted exactly 30 minutes of supervised contact with Lily at the municipal public park on the far edge of town. She explicitly stated in the message that I was not to mention the antique shop, the business finances, or Julian in any capacity whatsoever. If I violated a single one of her arbitrary rules, she warned that she would terminate the visit immediately, take my granddaughter away, and file the permanent restraining order she had threatened in her slick lawyer letter. I swallowed my burning pride. I typed back a simple one-word confirmation. I would have agreed to walk barefoot across miles of broken glass just to see my granddaughter for 5 short seconds. I put on my thickest wool sweater, grabbed my keys, and drove my old truck toward the municipal park. The Pennsylvania afternoon was exceptionally bleak and completely overcast. A harsh, biting winter wind swept violently through the tall, barren oak trees, scattering dead brown leaves across the empty asphalt paths. I parked my truck near the rusted chain-link fence and walked slowly over to a cold green metal bench positioned near the aging swing set. The park was entirely deserted. It felt significantly less like a place for joyful childhood memories and much more like a desolate, isolated staging ground for a tense hostage exchange. I sat there rubbing my aching, stiff knees, praying to the memory of my late wife, Sarah, that Lily was safe and happy, despite the suffocating darkness her mother was actively building around our entire family. 10 agonizing minutes later, Chloe imported luxury sport utility vehicle pulled aggressively up to the curb. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Chloe stepped out of the driver's side first. She was wearing a tailored tan trench coat, holding her expensive cell phone tightly against her ear, clearly engrossed in a serious conversation. She did not even bother to look in my direction or acknowledge my presence. She casually reached back, opened the heavy rear door, and practically pulled Lily out onto the sidewalk by her tiny wrist. When I finally saw my granddaughter clearly, the breath was completely and forcefully knocked out of my lungs. I had to grip the freezing cold metal armrest of the park bench with both hands just to keep myself from falling forward onto the pavement. This was not the vibrant, wildly joyful 6-year-old girl who used to stand on a stepping stool to help me mix blueberry pancake batter every single Sunday morning. Lily looked absolutely heartbreakingly exhausted. Her normally bright, bouncy blonde hair was severely unkempt and tangled in the back, hastily pulled into a crooked, messy ponytail. She was wearing a thin, faded denim jacket that was not nearly warm enough to protect her from the bitter, biting wind howling through the park. But the most devastating and horrifying detail was her sweet, innocent face. Her beautiful eyes were dull, downcast, and completely drained of life. Beneath them were deep, dark, bruised-looking circles that spoke of countless terror-filled sleepless nights and a profound, silent anxiety that no child should ever have to carry. The spark of pure childhood joy had been completely and systematically extinguished from her soul. The physical pain of seeing her in this deplorable condition was far worse than the agonizing arthritis in my hands. Chloe marched her over to the edge of the playground, wood chips still aggressively talking into her cell phone about commercial property valuations, demolition permits, and offshore wire transfers. Chloe pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the empty swings and casually told Lily to go play with her grandfather. Then, without offering a single word of greeting or a simple glance in my direction, Chloe turned her back and walked 20 paces away to continue her hushed, frantic phone call. She paced back and forth near the edge of the barren tree line, completely absorbed in her own treacherous, greedy world, leaving us entirely alone for a brief, incredibly fragile window of time. I immediately dropped to my aching knees right there on the cold, damp wood chips beneath the swing set. I opened my arms wide completely, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my legs. Lily did not run to me with her usual joyous shout. She walked incredibly slowly, dragging her worn-out sneakers, her small shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. She leaned heavily into my chest, completely collapsing into my embrace. I wrapped my large, calloused hands around her fragile little body, burying my weathered face in her messy, tangled hair. I felt a hot, burning tear slide uncontrollably down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away against the shoulder of my wool sweater. I absolutely had to be strong for her. I could not break down right now. I asked her how she was doing, forcing myself to keep my voice as warm, steady, and comforting as I possibly could. I told her how much I loved her, and how much I missed our Sunday morning pancake traditions. Lily clung to my wool sweater with desperate, trembling little fingers. She looked around the empty playground nervously, her terrified, bloodshot eyes darting instantly toward her mother, who was still aggressively pacing and arguing into her cell phone in the far distance. Lily squeezed her eyes shut tight and pressed her cold, pale face deeply into the crook of my neck. She spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, a sound so incredibly fragile and broken that it shattered my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "Grandpa," she whispered, her tiny voice shaking with suppressed sobs. "Mommy yells at Daddy a lot. She yells all the time. They fight all night long in the kitchen. Daddy does not yell back. Daddy just sits in the dark and cries. I tightened my embrace around her, my blood running completely cold. I rubbed her back soothingly, telling her in a soft murmur that everything was going to be okay, that I was there for her. I wanted to storm over to Chloe and demand answers, but I knew I had to stay perfectly still to keep Lily talking. She was not finished. She pulled back slightly, looking deep into my eyes with a profound, terrifying wisdom and a raw fear that no 6-year-old child should ever have to endure. "And the scary man with the shiny shoes comes over when Daddy is away," she continued, her bottom lip quivering uncontrollably. "He drives the loud black car. He goes into the home office with Mommy and locks the heavy door. He stares at me, and it scares me, Grandpa." I felt a sickening, violent wave of nausea roll through my stomach. The man with the shiny shoes. The commercial real estate developer driving the luxury sports car. Chloe was bringing him into my son's house, parading him right in front of my innocent granddaughter, while Julian was completely oblivious and locked away in the misery of a failing marriage. But what Lily whispered next was the absolute, final, devastating blow. "Mommy says we are moving far away soon." Lily sobbed, tears finally spilling over her dark, exhausted eyelids and tracking down her pale cheeks. She told me to pack my favorite toys in a secret bag. She says we are going to live in a big new house by the ocean and leave Daddy behind because he is weak and useless. Mommy says Daddy is going to lose everything and we can never come back here. The word moving slammed directly into my chest with the destructive, unstoppable force of a physical heavy iron blow. The freezing air suddenly vanished entirely from my lungs. A cold, absolute, paralyzing terror spread rapidly through every single vein and artery in my aged body. Moving far away, leaving Julian completely behind, taking my precious innocent granddaughter to some unknown location by the ocean with a wealthy, manipulative, ruthless real estate developer. If Chloe managed to successfully finalize the liquidation of my business, steal the massive cash reserves from Caldwell antique timepieces, and execute this monstrous calculated plan, she would completely vanish with the stolen money and take Lily right along with her. I would never ever see my granddaughter again. Julian would be left completely bankrupt, emotionally shattered, entirely abandoned, and ultimately destroyed by the woman he had foolishly trusted with his life. The sheer overwhelming cruelty of her meticulously crafted plot was utterly beyond anything I had ever imagined possible in my worst, darkest nightmares. I looked up over Lily's shoulder at Chloe. She was still pacing furiously near the barren oak trees, gesturing wildly with her free hand, completely oblivious to the fact that her own neglected, traumatized child had just handed me the missing pieces to her entire sinister puzzle. The timeline was rapidly accelerating. The slow, methodical destruction of my shop was clearly reaching its final, fatal conclusion. The danger was no longer just about losing an antique shop, a commercial bank account, or my personal legacy. It was about losing the absolute beating center of my family forever. I squeezed Lily tight, kissing the top of her messy head, and swore to her in the quietest, firmest, most resolute voice I possessed that I would absolutely never let anyone take her away from me. I told her that her grandfather loved her more than the stars in the sky, and that I was going to fix everything very soon. I slowly stood up, my arthritic knees popping loudly in the cold air just as Chloe aggressively ended her phone call and marched back across the wood chips to snatch Lily away from me. Chloe glared at me, grabbed Lily by the shoulder, and told me my 30 minutes were up. She dragged my weeping granddaughter back to the imported luxury vehicle without another word, shoving her into the back seat and slamming the door shut with a loud, violently echoing bang. As I watched Chloe speed away down the gray, desolate street, my paralyzing fear rapidly and forcefully transformed into a burning, unstoppable, righteous fury. The 2 weeks of agonizing, silent waiting were officially over. The stakes had been raised to life and death for my family. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the voice-activated audio recorder hidden deep inside the dark hollow base of the 18th century French grandfather clock must have captured enough concrete evidence to expose her entire sinister operation. The clock was ticking. The deadline was approaching, and it was time for me to return to the shadows, retrieve the device, and drag the ugly, undeniable truth out into the blinding light of day. That very same night, I waited until the streets of Lancaster were completely dead and silent. The brutal winter wind was still howling against the siding of my modest house, but I could not simply sit in my armchair and let my family be destroyed. I put my dark canvas jacket back on and drove my truck toward the historic downtown district. I parked 2 blocks away from the antique shop, just as I had done before. I pulled my wool beanie down over my freezing ears and walked through the dark, cobblestone alleyways. My arthritic knees burned with every single step, but the sheer terror of losing my granddaughter Lily fueled my aging body. I reached the overgrown patch of dead ivy in the back alley and pulled it aside to reveal the rusted iron storm hatch. I unlocked the heavy brass padlock with my skeleton key and pulled the iron door open. I descended into the pitch-black root cellar for the second time. The damp smell of old earth and stone filled my lungs. I moved blindly through the absolute darkness, relying entirely on 40 years of muscle memory to guide me toward the wooden trap door in the ceiling. I unlatched the heavy timber and pushed it upward inch by inch, cringing at every tiny creak the old wood made. I pulled myself up into the main showroom of Caldwell antique timepieces. The space was still painted a blinding, sterile white, stripped of all its beautiful mahogany and history. I crept across the newly tiled floor, moving directly toward the magnificent 18th century French grandfather clock standing in the center of the room. I dropped to my aching knees and ran my thumbs along the bottom edge of the solid oak base. I pressed the hidden pressure points simultaneously, and the secret compartment popped open with a faint metallic click. I reached my hand into the dark void, and my fingers brushed against the small plastic casing of the voice-activated digital audio recorder. I grabbed it tightly, securing it deep inside my jacket pocket. I closed the hidden oak panel and retreated to the trap door, sliding back down into the freezing cellar. I locked the iron hatch in the alleyway and walked quickly back to my truck. I did not see any security patrols this time. I drove straight home, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. When I finally walked through my front door, I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. I walked into my quiet living room, guided only by the soft amber glow of the street lamp shining through the front window. I sat down heavily in my worn leather armchair. Above the stone fireplace, the silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Sarah, seemed to look down at me with a deep, silent urging. I pulled my laptop from the side table and booted it up. My hands were trembling violently as I plugged the small black digital recorder into the side port of the computer. The screen illuminated my weathered face as the audio files loaded onto the desktop. There were dozens of small audio clips captured over the past 2 weeks. I combined them into one continuous track, put on a pair of heavy headphones, and took a deep, shaking breath. I moved the mouse and clicked play. At first, there was nothing but the ambient noise of the shop. I heard the steady rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock itself. Then I heard the sharp chime of the front door opening. I heard the distinct authoritative clicking of Chloe, wearing her expensive high heels, walking across the hard tile floor. But she was not alone. Heavy, confident footsteps followed right behind her. I heard the sound of ice clinking in glass tumblers. Then a man spoke. His voice was deep, arrogant, and dripping with a sleazy kind of confidence. I instantly recognized the tone of a man who believed he owned the entire world. It was Derek, the commercial real estate developer I had seen driving the sleek midnight black luxury sports car. I sat frozen in my armchair listening as the two of them laughed together. It was not a polite, professional laugh. It was an intimate, cruel, and deeply conspiratorial laughter. Chloe poured him a drink, and I heard her tell him to make himself comfortable because Julian was across town running a meaningless errand she had invented just to get him out of the house. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot, but the infidelity was only the absolute tip of the nightmare. Derek asked Chloe if the latest wire transfer had cleared without any issues. Chloe laughed a sharp, mocking sound and confirmed that it had. She proudly bragged to Derek that she had successfully drained another $25,000 from my business operating account that very morning. She told him that funneling the cash into his shell company was the easiest thing she had ever done. Apex Horizon was not a digital marketing firm. It was an absolute phantom entity entirely created by Derek to launder the cash reserves that Sarah and I had spent 4 decades building. They were openly joking about how incredibly gullible my son was for believing her corporate marketing jargon. Derek praised her manipulation, calling her a brilliant partner in crime. The sheer absolute betrayal radiating through the headphones made my blood run entirely cold. But as the recording continued, the true scale of their monstrous plot began to unfold piece by piece. They were not just content with stealing the cash reserves, they were actively orchestrating a complete and devastating hostile takeover of the entire property. Derek stated that the real value was not in the antique clocks or the business itself, but in the historic building my shop occupied. The downtown district was undergoing massive gentrification. Derek wanted to demolish my beautiful historic brick building and replace it with a lucrative multi-story commercial high-rise. I listened in absolute horror as Chloe meticulously laid out her plan to ruin my son. She explained that she had been slowly poisoning Julian against me, convincing him that he needed to assert his independence and take full control of the legacy. Her ultimate goal was to manipulate Julian into signing over his remaining equity in the property directly to her name under the guise of an asset protection strategy. Once she held the sole legal rights to the building, she was going to sell it to Derek Real Estate Development Firm for absolute pennies on the dollar. Derek would acquire a multi-million-dollar property for a fraction of its true worth, ensuring his firm made a massive, untraceable profit. The cruelty did not stop there. Once the building was sold and the cash was fully liquidated into their hidden offshore accounts, Chloe planned to blindside Julian with divorce papers. She coldly calculated that Julian would be left completely bankrupt, without a business, without a building, and without a single penny to his name. She laughed as she told Derek that Julian was too emotionally fragile to ever fight back in court. She was going to leave my trusting, gentle son completely destroyed and destitute, while she and Derek walked away with the fortune my wife and I had bled for. I squeezed my eyes shut, the physical pain in my chest feeling like a heavy iron anvil crushing my lungs. Hearing the woman who slept next to my son casually plot his absolute financial and emotional slaughter was a level of evil I could barely comprehend. But then the audio shifted, and they began to speak about Lily, my sweet, innocent 6-year-old granddaughter. Derek complained that a child would be a massive burden on their new lifestyle. He whined that he did not want to spend his wealth playing stepfather to a crying little girl. Chloe immediately dismissed his concerns with a tone so incredibly devoid of maternal love it made me physically sick. She told Derek not to worry about Lily. She casually stated that once the divorce was finalized and they had the money, she was going to petition for full custody just to ensure Julian had to pay child support he could not afford. Then she planned to ship Lily off to a cheap year-round boarding school on the other side of the country. She joked that out of sight meant out of mind. She told Derek they could travel across Europe and build their new mansion by the ocean without the annoying distraction of a needy child. A hot, blinding tear tracked down my weathered cheek. The image of my precious granddaughter, the little girl who loved making blueberry pancakes with me, sitting alone and frightened in some distant boarding school away from the father who adored her, completely broke me. Chloe viewed her own flesh and blood as nothing more than an inconvenient chess piece to be discarded the moment she secured her stolen wealth. I clenched my fists so hard, my arthritic joints screamed in agony. I wanted to reach through the computer screen and tear her apart with my bare hands. But the final knife, the absolute most chilling and terrifying segment of the entire recording, was still to come. I heard the clinking of ice in their glasses again, as Derek brought up a potential flaw in their perfect plan. He asked Chloe what they were going to do about me. He pointed out that as the founder of the business, I still had legal standing to challenge the fraudulent sale of the building if I managed to convince a judge to look at the original incorporation documents. He told Chloe that I was a stubborn old mule who would never stop fighting them. Chloe let out a long, dramatic sigh. She told Derek that she had already anticipated my interference, and that she had the perfect permanent solution to silence me forever. She reminded him of the slick corporate lawyer she had hired, and the cease and desist letter she had sent accusing me of dementia. She explained that she had been carefully documenting every single time I raised my voice or demanded answers, framing my righteous anger as severe paranoid delusions. Then Derek laughed. It was a dark, menacing sound. He told Chloe that he had a personal friend on his payroll, a highly unethical psychiatrist who owed him several massive favors. Derek proposed that they use Chloe-documented fabrications to file an emergency medical injunction against me. They planned to bring this corrupt doctor into the court to formally testify that my mental faculties had completely deteriorated and that I was a severe danger to myself and my family. I sat utterly paralyzed in my leather armchair, listening to the exact details of my own demise. Chloe eagerly agreed to the plan. They were going to have me declared legally incompetent. They were going to strip away my fundamental human rights, invalidate my voice in a court of law, and forcefully lock me away in a state-run psychiatric nursing facility against my will. Once I was declared legally insane, any testimony or legal challenge I raised regarding the stolen money or the fraudulent building sale would be immediately dismissed by a judge as the ravings of a madman. I would be trapped behind locked doors, heavily medicated, and completely silenced while they demolished my shop, bankrupted my son, and abandoned my granddaughter. The audio file clicked and hummed, falling into a silent static as their conversation ended, and they left the office. I reached up and slowly pulled the heavy headphones off my ears. The silence of my living room was deafening. I sat completely still, staring at the glowing screen of the laptop. My breathing was ragged and shallow. The sheer magnitude of their malice was suffocating. They were not just greedy, they were systematically ruthless. They had covered every single angle, exploiting the law, exploiting medicine, and exploiting my son, trusting nature to execute a flawless destruction of the Caldwell family. I looked up again at the silver-framed photograph of Sarah on the mantel. In the dim light, her smile seemed to urge me forward. The overwhelming grief and the paralyzing fear that had gripped me for the past 2 weeks completely evaporated. The sadness was entirely burned away, leaving behind an absolute freezing and unbreakable resolve. I was not a senile old man. I was a master horologist, a man who had spent 40 years understanding exactly how tiny, hidden gears worked together to move the hands of time. I knew how to take complex, broken machines apart, and I knew exactly how to put them back together. Chloe and Derek thought they had built a perfect, unstoppable machine. They thought they had accounted for every single variable. But they had absolutely no idea that I possessed the master blueprint to their entire criminal conspiracy sitting right here on a small digital drive. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. The recording was crystal clear. The admission of grand larceny fraud and conspiracy was undeniably captured in their own arrogant voices. I reached forward and ejected the small black recorder from the side of my laptop. I held it tightly in my scarred, calloused palm, feeling the hard plastic edges pressing into my skin. I did not need to run or hide anymore. I needed to act. The time for silent mourning was officially over. It was time to stop their clock permanently. I did not break down. The tears that had gathered in my eyes simply dried up, replaced instantly by a cold and absolute certainty. The woman who had infiltrated my family thought she was dealing with a foolish, defeated old man. She thought I would simply wither away in the shadows of my empty house, paralyzed by the horrific threats her slick corporate lawyer had mailed to me. She thought her meticulously crafted illusion was entirely bulletproof. She was entirely wrong. The overwhelming grief that had suffocated me for 2 agonizing weeks burned away in a matter of seconds. It transformed into a pure, icy resolve. I reached for my cell phone, resting on the side table. My hands were no longer shaking. My breathing was completely steady. I opened my contacts and dialed a number I had known by heart for over 4 decades. It was the private number for Thomas Mitchell. Thomas was my late wife, Sarah's older brother. For 35 years, he had served as a lead senior investigator for the county sheriff department. He was a man carved from solid granite, a man who had seen the absolute worst of human nature and had never once blinked. When Sarah passed away, Thomas and I had leaned on each other to survive the crushing grief. We shared a quiet, profound understanding built on decades of mutual respect and family loyalty. He loved my son Julian like his own, and he absolutely adored my granddaughter Lily. I knew that if there was one single man on this earth who possessed the knowledge, the grit, and the unyielding moral compass to help me tear down Chloe's deceitful empire, it was Thomas. He answered on the second ring. His deep, gravelly voice echoed through the small speaker of my phone. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I needed him at my house immediately. I told him it involved Julian, it involved Lily, and it involved the survival of the antique shop his sister had bled for. Thomas did not ask a single question. He simply told me he was grabbing his keys and getting in his truck. 20 minutes later, his heavy-duty pickup truck pulled into my driveway, the headlights sweeping across my dark living room window. Thomas walked through my front door wearing his faded brown leather jacket. His sharp, highly observant eyes instantly scanned my face, reading the severe gravity of the situation etched deep into my wrinkles. I led him straight into my living room. I motioned for him to sit on the sofa opposite my worn leather armchair. I did not try to verbally explain the complex, sickening web of lies I had just discovered. Words would not have done it justice. I simply opened my laptop, turned the volume speakers all the way up, and pressed play on the audio file I had extracted from the hidden grandfather clock. I sat back and watched Thomas intently as the recording played. I watched his thick, calloused hands grip the fabric of the sofa armrests. As Chloe's arrogant voice filled the quiet room, boasting about draining my operating accounts and mocking my gentle son, the muscles in Thomas's jaw tightened dangerously. When Derek's sleazy, arrogant voice joined the conversation outlining the hostile takeover and the planned demolition of our historic shop building, a dark, furious red color crept rapidly up from Thomas's neck. But it was the final devastating segment that truly broke the dam of his composure. When Chloe coldly laughed about sending little Lily away to a cheap boarding school and outlined her sinister plan to lock me away in a psychiatric facility using a corrupt doctor, Thomas abruptly stood up. He paced across my living room floor, his broad chest heaving with an intense righteous fury. He looked at the silver-framed photograph of his sister Sarah resting on the fireplace mantel. He swore out loud, making a harsh, bitter promise to the empty room, that he would personally ensure Chloe spent the best years of her life staring at cold, concrete prison walls. Thomas walked back to the laptop and paused the recording. He looked at me, the fury in his eyes slowly transforming into the cold, heavily calculating gaze of a veteran detective. He told me that the audio recording was a massive, unprecedented victory. It gave us the undeniable raw truth of their entire conspiracy. However, he warned me with brutal professional honesty that we were still facing an incredibly steep uphill legal battle. Audio recordings are great for leverage, Harrison Thomas explained, his voice low and serious. They are perfect for backing rats into a corner. But in a court of law, defense attorneys can challenge them. They can claim the audio was obtained illegally, or they can argue that the voices were manipulated out of context. If we take this tape straight to the police right now, Chloe's expensive lawyers will immediately file an injunction, tie the evidence up in endless hearings, and execute her plan to declare you mentally incompetent before a judge ever hears a single second of this file. To put a woman like Chloe behind bars and save Julian, we need the concrete paper trail to make it an undeniable criminal matter. We need financial documents, forged signatures, and bank records that no slick corporate lawyer can possibly explain away. We need to build an ironclad cage around her. I nodded slowly, fully understanding the severe reality of our situation. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded certified bank statements I had obtained from Martha at the bank 2 weeks prior. I laid them flat on the coffee table. I told Thomas these documents proved the massive unauthorized wire transfers to the mysterious shell company called Apex Horizon. Thomas sat back down and studied the papers, intently pulling a pair of reading glasses from his jacket pocket. He ran his thick finger down the columns of stolen money. He pulled out his own cell phone and started making calls. Even though he was officially retired from the sheriff department, he still commanded absolute respect and possessed deep, loyal connections within the Financial Crimes Division and the local municipal offices. Over the next 48 hours, my modest dining room transformed completely into a desperate high-stakes command center. We barely slept. We drank pot after pot of bitter black coffee, the caffeine fueling our frantic race against the clock. Thomas reached out to a trusted retired forensic accountant he had worked with on major fraud cases for years. Operating discreetly under the radar, they managed to trace the specific routing numbers and corporate registration filings attached to Apex Horizon. Within a day, they officially and legally linked the dummy corporation directly back to Derek's primary commercial real estate development firm in Philadelphia. The financial puzzle was falling perfectly into place. We now had physical proof that Chloe was illegally funneling my family's wealth straight into her lover's pockets, but Thomas knew that the financial theft, while severe, was only half of their conspiracy. To truly seize the historic building and execute their plan to demolish it, Chloe needed to officially transfer the property deed. Because I was the primary founder and perpetual guarantor of the business, my signature was absolutely legally required on any document authorizing the sale or transfer of the property itself. Julian's signature alone was not enough to finalize a real estate transaction of that magnitude. On Thursday morning, Thomas drove downtown to the county clerk records office. He called in a massive favor with a senior records clerk he had known for decades. He asked her to quietly pull and review any recent filings pending transfers or notarized documents related to Caldwell antique timepieces or the physical address of the shop. I stayed behind at my house, pacing the hardwood floors, my stomach twisting with a sickening, heavy anxiety. Every single hour that passed felt like a lifetime. When Thomas finally returned to my house that evening, the Lancaster sun was setting behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across my lawn. Thomas walked through the front door, his expression completely grim and utterly devoid of hope. He did not say a word as he walked into the dining room. He opened his leather briefcase and laid a thick stack of freshly photocopied legal documents directly onto the center of my dining table. They were commercial property transfer authorizations. They were the exact legal instruments required to effectively sign away my remaining equity in the historic building, remove my name entirely from the foundational incorporation, and grant Julian complete, uncontested sole ownership of the real estate. I stepped up to the table and stared at the bottom of the final notarized page. Right there, resting on the thick black signature line, was my name. It was my distinct cursive handwriting. The loops of the letters and the sharp angles of my initials were incredibly, horrifyingly accurate. If I had simply glanced at it in passing, I might have believed I actually signed it myself. But I had never seen this specific legal document in my entire life. A sickening, violent wave of revulsion washed completely over me. It was a profound psychological violation to see my own identity stolen and weaponized against my family. Thomas pointed to the signature with a heavy pen. He explained that a seasoned fraud investigator could easily spot the subtle, unnatural pressure points in the ink. He pointed out where the pen had hesitated slightly on the upward curves. Chloe had not just stumbled her way through a sloppy fake signature. She had meticulously and obsessively practiced my handwriting. She had studied my old checks, my handwritten business ledgers, and my antique restoration certificates, perfecting every single curve and line of my name until she could forge it well enough to pass a basic, superficial, bureaucratic inspection. She had stolen my identity to push the building sale forward entirely without my consent. We gathered every single piece of evidence together on the dining room table. We compiled the certified bank statements showing the fraudulent transfers. We printed out the comprehensive corporate tracing that linked Apex Horizon directly to Derek. We placed the heavily forged property transfer documents in clear plastic sleeves. Finally, we copied the damning crystal-clear audio recording from the grandfather clock onto a secure digital flash drive. We combined all of this into one massive, devastating dossier of absolute fraud, grand embezzlement, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. It was no longer just a bitter civil dispute between an old father and an arrogant daughter-in-law. It was a heavily documented, severe federal crime. Chloe had dug her own massive grave with her endless, arrogant greed. We had gathered the exact, undeniable ammunition we needed to completely obliterate her false narrative. She would never ever be able to stand in front of a judge and claim I was a demented, paranoid old man again. We held the absolute truth in our hands. But just as we were finalizing the thick binder of evidence late Thursday afternoon, the sharp, urgent chime of a text message echoed through the quiet dining room. Thomas picked up his cell phone. It was an urgent alert from his loyal contact at the county clerk office. I watched Thomas read the message, and I saw all the remaining color instantly drain from his weathered face. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden escalating panic. He told me we were completely out of time. His contact had just flagged a final highly expedited closing schedule in the county system. Chloe and Derek were not waiting for the end of the month to finalize their scheme. They had bumped the timeline up aggressively. They had scheduled the absolute final closing meeting for the complete sale of the historic building for that very next morning. The meeting was set to take place at exactly 10 o'clock on Friday, at an extremely high-end corporate law firm in downtown Lancaster. Thomas explained the horrifying, immediate reality of the situation. Julian was going to be at that meeting. My gentle, trusting, completely blind son was going to sit down at a massive mahogany conference table and blindly sign the final binding closing papers. He was going to legally sell our historic building, the very soul of our family legacy, directly to Derek's development firm for absolute pennies on the dollar, entirely sealing his own financial doom. The second that ink dried on the paper, the money would vanish into their offshore accounts. Chloe was going to take the liquidated cash and run executing her plan to file for divorce, steal Lily, and leave my son completely bankrupt and entirely destroyed. I looked up at the antique wall clock ticking loudly in my living room. We had less than 18 hours to stop the total absolute destruction of my family. I reached out and closed the thick, heavy cover of the evidence binder. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it completely masked the burning arthritis in my joints. I looked Thomas directly in the eyes and told him we were absolutely not going to let that happen. We were going to wake up tomorrow morning, we were going to walk straight into that high-end downtown law firm, and we were going to spring the trap. Friday morning broke with a cold and heavy gray sky hanging low over the city of Lancaster. I woke up in the pitch-black hours long before the sun even considered rising over the horizon. I lay in my bed for a long time, simply staring up at the dark ceiling and listening to the absolute silence of my empty house. For the first time in several weeks, I did not feel the usual burning arthritis flaring up in my knees or the stiff, aching pain settling deep in my calloused hands. The intense physical pain that usually plagued my 68-year-old body had been entirely erased by a massive surging wave of pure icy adrenaline. Today was the single most important day of my entire life. Today was the day I had to save my son Julian from complete financial ruin and rescue my precious granddaughter Lily from a monstrous future. I threw the heavy blankets off my body and walked slowly into my bedroom. I opened the heavy wooden doors of my closet and reached all the way to the very back corner. I pulled out a thick protective plastic garment bag and unzipped it with steady, deliberate fingers. Inside the bag was my absolute finest suit. It was a dark charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored and completely pristine. It was the exact same suit I wore to my beautiful wife, Sarah. Funeral many years ago. I had not touched that suit or even looked at it since that terrible rainy afternoon when we buried her. I carried the suit over to my bed and laid the jacket and trousers down, carefully smoothing out the fabric with my hands. I remembered standing by her graveside on that devastating day, making a silent and sacred promise to protect our family forever. Today, I was finally going to honor that promise with absolute finality. I slowly put on the crisp white dress shirt, buttoning it all the way up to my neck. I tied a dark silk tie and slipped into the heavy wool trousers. I sat on the edge of the bed and slipped my feet into my polished black leather shoes, tying the laces tightly. I walked over to the tall mirror standing in the corner of my bedroom and looked deeply at my own reflection. I did not see the broken, confused, and defeated old man that Chloe had so desperately tried to paint me as. I did not see a senile grandfather losing his mind to dementia. I saw a seasoned master horologist. I saw a hardened veteran of life who had spent 40 years building a legacy with his bare hands. I saw a father who was completely prepared to tear down walls to save his own flesh and blood from absolute destruction. I walked into the dining room and grabbed the thick, heavy leather briefcase resting on the table. Inside that briefcase was the ironclad dossier of absolute fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy that Thomas and I had built. It contained the forged property transfer documents, the certified bank statements, showing the massive embezzlement, and the secure digital flash drive holding the crystal-clear audio recordings of Chloe and Derek plotting their hostile takeover. I gripped the leather handle tightly and walked out of my front door into the freezing morning air. I looked down my driveway and saw Thomas sitting quietly in his heavy-duty pickup truck waiting patiently for me. I walked down the concrete driveway and climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, closing the heavy metal door firmly behind me. Thomas looked over at me and gave a single firm nod of deep mutual understanding. As a retired county sheriff investigator who had spent 35 years hunting criminals, he knew exactly how to read a man. He knew the immense emotional weight of the dark charcoal suit I was wearing. He shifted the heavy truck into gear, and we drove away from my quiet suburban neighborhood, heading straight toward the bustling downtown financial district of Lancaster. We did not speak a single word to each other during the entire 20-minute drive. The silence inside the cab of the truck was not empty or uncomfortable. It was filled with a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying resolve. I looked out the passenger window and watched the city pass by. We drove past the historic brick buildings and the small family-owned shops where honest people worked hard to earn a living. I thought about the antique shop I had built from nothing and how a greedy, manipulative woman was currently trying to sell it for pennies on the dollar to fuel her own selfish desires. The warm, historic architecture of the city suddenly changed into towering, intimidating structures of cold steel and highly reflective glass. These were the buildings where the corporate elite hid their dirty secrets. Thomas pulled his large truck directly into the dark underground parking garage of the most expensive high-rise corporate law firm in the entire city. The tires squeaked loudly against the smooth concrete as he parked in a visitor space. We stepped out of the vehicle, and the damp, freezing chill of the underground garage settled deep into my bones. We walked side by side toward the gleaming brass elevators located at the far end of the parking structure. Thomas stood incredibly tall, his broad shoulders squared and his posture perfectly straight. He carried the quiet but undeniable and absolute authority of a man who possessed a deep, unyielding moral compass. We pressed the call button and waited in total silence. The elevator arrived, and we rode it all the way up to the top floor of the high-rise building. The brass doors opened with a soft, pleasant chime, revealing an incredibly lavish and intimidating reception area. The floors were made of highly polished imported white marble that gleamed perfectly under the recessed ceiling lights. The expansive walls were adorned with incredibly expensive modern art pieces designed to make ordinary people feel small and insignificant. A young professional receptionist wearing a sleek wireless headset sat behind a massive curved glass desk in the center of the lobby. She looked up from her computer monitor and offered us a polite, highly trained corporate smile. She asked us in a soft, pleasant voice if we had a scheduled appointment with any of the senior partners. I did not say a single word to her. I simply kept my eyes fixed straight ahead and continued walking purposefully toward the long carpeted hallway that led to the executive conference rooms. The receptionist panicked slightly, realizing we were entirely ignoring her authority. She stood up quickly from her expensive leather chair and raised her voice, telling us firmly that we were absolutely not allowed to proceed down the hallway without proper security clearance and a registered visitor badge. Thomas stepped smoothly and deliberately in front of me, perfectly intercepting her line of sight. He reached deep into the inner pocket of his faded brown leather jacket and pulled out his retired county sheriff investigator badge. The heavy, solid gold star flashed brightly under the pristine lobby lighting. He leaned over the curved glass desk and gave her a stern, completely uncompromising look that would have instantly frozen boiling water. He told her in a low, dangerous, rumbling voice that this was official county business regarding a major criminal fraud investigation, and that she needed to sit back down in her chair and remain completely silent if she did not want to be charged with obstructing justice. The young receptionist immediately gasped and sank back into her leather chair, her eyes wide with genuine shock and absolute fear. She did not dare to reach for her telephone or press the security panic button. We completely bypassed the main security desk without breaking our stride for a single second and walked straight down the long, quiet, carpeted hallway toward the main executive conference rooms. My heart pounded violently against my ribs with every single purposeful step I took down that long, quiet hallway. The thick, expensive carpet completely muffled the sound of our hard leather shoes. As we approached the very end of the corridor, I could hear the faint, muffled murmur of voices coming from the massive room on the right side. It was the room where the final closing meeting for the sale of the historic building was taking place. I stopped directly in front of the massive, highly polished mahogany doors. I stood there for a brief moment and took one final deep breath, filling my aging lungs with cold air. I gripped the heavy decorative brass handles with both my calloused hands and pushed the massive mahogany doors open with a loud, violent, echoing bang. The heavy wooden doors slammed incredibly hard against the interior walls of the conference room. The sudden, violently loud noise completely and utterly shattered the quiet, professional, and highly controlled atmosphere inside the room. I stepped across the threshold with my head held high, with Thomas walking right beside me, holding the thick leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. The scene inside the room unfolded in front of my eyes like a vivid, slow-motion nightmare. It was a massive, elegant conference room with a long, highly polished oak table completely dominating the center of the space. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the dark, gray city skyline below. And right there, sitting at the very head of the massive oak table, sat my gentle, trusting, and completely oblivious son, Julian. He was holding a heavy gold fountain pen very tightly in his right hand. The sharp tip of the expensive pen was hovering less than an entire inch above a massive, thick stack of complex legal closing documents. Julian looked absolutely exhausted, entirely defeated, and completely drained of his life force. Standing directly behind his plush leather chair was his wife, Chloe. She was wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive dark designer dress. She was leaning over Julian with her hands resting possessively and heavily on his shoulders, pushing him down into submission. Her sharp eyes were practically drooling with raw, unfiltered, and sickening anticipation. She was literally moments away from seizing the entire family legacy and executing her flawless, hostile takeover. Sitting directly across the wide, polished oak table was Derek, the commercial real estate developer. He wore a custom-tailored imported suit and a bright, smug, deeply arrogant smile. He was leaning back comfortably in his expensive chair, looking exactly like a greedy king who had just effortlessly conquered a weak and defenseless country. When the heavy mahogany doors banged open with explosive force, the smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from Derek's face in a fraction of a second. Julian physically jumped in his leather seat, dropping the heavy gold pen directly onto the polished table with a loud clatter. His exhausted eyes widened in absolute, unfiltered, and paralyzing shock as he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. Chloe gasped incredibly loudly, her hands flying aggressively off Julian's shoulders as she stood up completely straight, her entire body going rigid with terror. The sheer, utter panic that flashed across Chloe's beautiful, meticulously painted face was deeply, profoundly satisfying to witness. For one tiny fraction of a second, she looked exactly like a trapped, frightened animal, realizing the cage had just snapped shut. But she was a master manipulator, and she recovered her false composure with a terrifying, lightning-fast speed. Her initial shock instantly morphed into a furious, violently red-faced rage. She pointed a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at my chest and began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She demanded in a shrill, hysterical voice to know exactly how I had gotten past the lobby security desk. She yelled aggressively to the two stunned paralegals standing in the far corner of the room, ordering them to immediately pick up the telephone and call the police. She shrieked that I was an unstable, highly dangerous, and completely demented old man who was illegally trespassing on private commercial property and violating a cease and desist order. She quickly turned her attention down to Julian and hysterically claimed that I was clearly having another severe paranoid mental breakdown. She aggressively manipulated the situation, yelling that my violent, unpredictable behavior was exactly the precise reason why they needed to forcefully push the sale of the building forward today and protect their family from my escalating insanity. She played the part of the terrified victim absolutely flawlessly, projecting a desperate fake urgency to force the ink onto those legal papers before I could ruin her meticulously crafted plan. Julian looked completely physically paralyzed. He sat frozen in his large leather chair, staring at me with wide, terrified, and deeply conflicted eyes, his exhausted mind clearly struggling to process the sudden chaotic explosion happening in the room. He looked down at the heavy gold pen resting on the legal documents, and then slowly looked back up at my face. He opened his mouth to speak to me, but he could not find a single coherent word in his throat. Derek abruptly stood up from his chair, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with shaking hands, trying desperately to assert his false dominance over the room. He pointed at Thomas and me and told us in a loud, commanding voice that we needed to leave the private premises immediately, or we would be leaving the building in police handcuffs. He threatened us with a massive barrage of severe legal consequences using big, intimidating corporate words to mask his underlying panic and guilt. I did not look at Chloe as she continued to scream. I did not look at Derek as he continued to issue empty corporate threats. I completely and utterly ignored their pathetic, desperate noise. I walked very slowly and incredibly deliberately around the long edge of the highly polished oak table, keeping my eyes entirely locked on my son. I stopped just a few feet away from where Julian was sitting. The entire massive conference room seemed to hold its collective breath. The screaming and yelling faded into the background. I looked directly into Julian's eyes, and I spoke with a terrifying, absolute calm that cut straight through the frantic, desperate screaming filling the room. I said, "Son, put the pen down. You are signing away your life to a woman who is sleeping with the man across the table." The massive mahogany doors of the conference room had just slammed against the walls with a violently loud echo. The sheer force of our entrance completely shattered the quiet and sterile atmosphere of the high-end corporate law firm. I had just spoken the most devastating words a father could ever say to his own son. I had told Julian to drop his gold fountain pen because he was about to sign away his entire life to a woman who was intimately involved with the arrogant commercial developer sitting right across the polished oak table. For a few agonizing seconds, the entire room was completely paralyzed. The two paralegals standing in the corner stopped breathing entirely. Chloe stood frozen behind Julian, her manicured hands hovering uselessly in the air. Julian stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mind entirely incapable of processing the massive weight of the reality I had just dropped onto his shoulders. Derek was the very first person to break the heavy silence. He was a wealthy man who was completely accustomed to bullying his way through every single obstacle in his life. He let out a loud, arrogant scoff and abruptly stood up from his plush leather chair. He angrily buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket and began to march around the edge of the long oak conference table. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a thick, threatening finger directly at my face and ordered me to get out of his private meeting immediately. He took 2 more aggressive, heavy steps toward me, clearly intending to use his physical size to intimidate a man he believed was just a weak and senile grandfather. He thought he could simply push me out the door and return to stealing my family legacy. He was absolutely dead wrong. Before Derek could take a 3rd step, Thomas moved. My retired county sheriff brother-in-law did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped smoothly and deliberately, directly into Derek's path. Thomas was built like a solid wall of granite, and he carried the undeniable, dangerous authority of a man who had spent 35 years locking up criminals far worse than a sleazy real estate developer. Thomas planted his heavy boots firmly into the expensive carpet and stared down at Derek with a cold, dead-eyed glare. Derek abruptly stopped in his tracks, completely losing his forward momentum. The cowardly developer instinctively took a half-step backward, realizing instantly that he was completely outmatched by the veteran lawman standing in front of him. With Derek effectively neutralized and pinned in the corner of the room, Thomas casually lifted the heavy leather briefcase he had been carrying. He swung it up and dropped it squarely onto the center of the highly polished mahogany table with a massive, incredibly loud thud that made everyone in the room jump. Thomas unzipped the leather flap and reached his thick, calloused hands inside. He pulled out the massive stack of freshly printed documents we had spent the last 48 hours compiling. He spread them out across the table like a deck of playing cards for everyone to see. There were the certified bank statements showing the continuous and massive wire transfers draining my commercial operating accounts. There were the complex corporate tracing documents explicitly linking the dummy corporation Apex Horizon directly to Derek Primary Development Firm. And resting right on the very top of the pile were the heavily forged property transfer deeds. The fake signatures that Chloe had obsessively practiced and copied were displayed in plain, undeniable sight. The 2 paralegals in the room audibly gasped and took several steps back toward the wall, instantly recognizing the severe legal implications of forged real estate documents. Chloe stared at the paperwork spread across the table, and the remaining color completely drained from her meticulously painted face. But I was not finished. Paperwork was absolutely necessary for the police, but I needed Julian to hear the absolute ugly truth with his own 2 ears. I needed to break the dark, manipulative spell this woman had cast over his mind and his heart. I reached deep into the pocket of my dark, charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a small, heavy, portable Bluetooth speaker I had purchased earlier that morning. I set it down gently onto the table right next to the stack of forged documents. I pulled the tiny black digital audio recorder from my inner pocket, connected the wireless signal with a few quick taps, and pressed the play button. The audio filled the massive conference room with absolute, crystal-clear precision. The high-quality microphone I had hidden deep inside the antique grandfather clock had done its job flawlessly. The sound of ice clinking gently against expensive glass tumblers echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then Chloe's voice emerged from the speaker. It was not the sweet, caring, and deeply manipulative voice she used when speaking to my son. It was a cold, mocking, and incredibly arrogant tone. The recording captured her laughing hysterically, with Derek right inside my own antique shop. I watched Julian face closely as he heard his own wife laughing intimately with another man inside the business he was currently trying to save. The recording continued playing without mercy. Julian sat completely paralyzed as Chloe's voice filled the room, openly bragging about how incredibly easy it was to steal $25,000 from the business accounts that very morning. She boasted to Derek about how incredibly gullible Julian was for believing her fabricated stories about digital marketing retainers and corporate restructuring. She explicitly detailed how she was funneling my life savings directly into Derek's shell company. Every single word was a devastating sledgehammer blow to my son-trusting heart. But the horrific revelations were only just beginning to escalate. The audio shifted to their ultimate master plan. Chloe's voice echoed loudly, explaining how she was intentionally isolating Julian from his family and manipulating his desperate desire to prove himself. She laid out her exact strategy to force him to sign the property deeds today so they could sell the historic brick building to Derek's firm for absolute pennies on the dollar. She calmly and happily explained that they would immediately demolish the antique shop I had built to construct a highly profitable commercial high-rise. Then came the absolute worst betrayal of all. She laughed as she told Derek that the moment the sale was finalized and the cash was safely offshore, she was going to hit Julian with immediate divorce papers. She called my gentle, kind-hearted son weak and pathetic, stating that she was going to leave him entirely bankrupt and emotionally destroyed. I kept my eyes completely locked on Julian as the full weight of his wife's monstrous betrayal washed over him. The physical transformation of my son was absolutely agonizing to witness. The heavy gold fountain pen that he had been gripping so tightly finally slipped entirely from his trembling fingers. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp, loud clatter and rolled slowly onto the floor. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. His chest heaved as if the oxygen had been completely vacuumed out of the room. The absolute utter devastation in his eyes was almost too much for me to bear. He looked up at Chloe, the woman he had loved, the woman he had defended, and the woman he had banished his own father for. He looked at her not with anger, but with the profound, shattering realization that he was nothing more than a disposable pawn in her greedy, twisted game. His entire reality, his marriage, his future, and his family had been an absolute total illusion. But the recording was not finished destroying her. The speaker crackled slightly before Chloe's voice returned, this time, discussing my beautiful, innocent granddaughter. Derek complained on the tape about not wanting to deal with a crying child. Chloe immediately and coldly promised him that she was going to fight for full custody just to force Julian to pay child support, and then she was going to immediately ship little Lily off to a cheap year-round boarding school. She joked about abandoning her own flesh-and-blood daughter so she could travel across Europe and live in a mansion by the ocean. Then the audio reached its final chilling conclusion. Chloe eagerly agreed to Derek's plan to use a corrupt doctor on his payroll to have me declared legally insane. She plotted to lock me away in a psychiatric facility against my will just to ensure I could never legally challenge the fraudulent sale of the building. The audio file finally ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating, and completely dead silence in the conference room. The illusion was entirely irrevocably shattered. Chloe absolutely panicked. Her perfect, immaculate facade completely exploded into a million jagged pieces. She let out a wild, hysterical shriek and lunged aggressively across the mahogany table. She tried desperately to snatch the portable speaker and the digital recorder from the wood, but Thomas slammed his heavy hand down onto the table, completely blocking her reach. Chloe backed away, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. Her meticulously styled hair fell wildly across her face. She yelled frantically that the recording was completely illegal. She shrieked that I had violated state wiretapping laws by planting a hidden bug in her private office. She screamed at the terrified paralegals, demanding that they call building security to have me arrested for illegal surveillance and trespassing. She was frantically trying to cling to the last remaining shreds of her fabricated authority. Thomas looked at her and smiled. It was not a warm or friendly smile. It was the cold, highly satisfied smile of a veteran lawman watching a trap snap entirely shut around a predator. He crossed his thick arms over his chest and looked directly into Chloe's wild, terrified eyes. He told her in a low, booming voice that she was fundamentally misunderstanding the severity of her situation. He calmly explained that while secretly recording a conversation might pose a slight issue in a standard civil dispute, they were no longer dealing with a simple civil matter. He pointed a heavy finger at the massive stack of documents spread across the table. He told her that moving hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines into dummy corporations constituted massive federal wire fraud. He told her that forging legal real estate deeds and attempting to illegally transfer commercial property constituted severe federal grand larceny and identity theft. He informed her with absolute brutal clarity that the local authorities and federal financial investigators do not particularly care about the finer details of a hidden tape recorder when they are handed a mountain of undeniable verified bank fraud. Chloe's face turned the color of pale chalk. She took a stumbling step backward, bumping heavily into the leather chairs. She looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. Thomas slowly raised his left wrist and casually checked his watch. He looked back up at the terrified woman and announced that he had not come to this meeting alone. He stated that the local police and the Financial Crimes Division detectives had been waiting patiently down in the polished marble lobby for the past 20 minutes, reviewing the exact same dossier of forged documents we had just placed on the table. He told her that they were simply waiting for his signal. Right on absolute cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room swung open wide. 4 fully uniformed city police officers and 2 plainclothes financial crimes detectives stepped aggressively into the room. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly from a high-end corporate boardroom to an active, serious crime scene. The heavy sound of leather utility belts and police radios filled the quiet space. The lead detective, a tall, serious-looking man, stepped forward and announced that no one was permitted to leave the room. Derek finally realized that the walls had completely closed in around him. The smug, arrogant developer who had believed he owned the world suddenly turned into a pathetic, cowardly rat. He tried to slowly and quietly back away toward a secondary exit door located near the far corner of the room. He turned his shoulders and actually attempted to bolt for the door. He did not make it more than 2 single steps. One of the plainclothes detectives moved with blinding speed, lunging forward and violently shoving Derek hard against the floor to ceiling glass window. The sound of Derek's expensive custom-tailored suit tearing slightly echoed in the room as the detective aggressively pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy clinking of cold metal handcuffs locking tightly around Derek's wrists rang out like a beautiful bell of pure justice. The detective read him his rights while Derek squirmed and protested pathetically, demanding to speak to his expensive lawyers. The 2 uniformed officers approached Chloe. She completely lost whatever tiny fragment of sanity she had left. Her entire pristine, polished world was collapsing into ash, and she refused to go down quietly. She screamed, she cursed, and she kicked out wildly as the officers moved in. She threatened to sue the entire police department. She threatened to destroy my life, and she shrieked terrible, horrific insults at Julian. The officers were completely unimpressed. They grabbed her firmly by her arms, forcefully turning her around and pulling her wrists tightly behind her back. The metal cuffs ratcheted shut over her delicate skin. Her designer dress became wrinkled and twisted. Her face was streaked with running makeup, and ugly red splotches of hysterical rage. As they dragged her away from the table, she looked exactly like the incredibly ugly, twisted monster she had always truly been on the inside. They marched Derek and Chloe forcefully out of the conference room and out into the main hallway. The sound of Chloe hysterical screaming slowly faded away down the long carpeted corridor until the heavy mahogany doors swung shut, leaving the room completely silent once again. The two terrified paralegals quickly gathered their things and practically ran out the door, eager to escape the devastation. The noise and the chaos completely vanished, leaving only the heavy aftermath of the truth. I slowly turned away from the door and looked back at the long oak table. Julian was left standing completely alone. He looked down at the massive stack of forged property deeds and fraudulent bank transfers. He looked at the heavy gold fountain pen resting uselessly on the expensive carpet. Then his shaking legs finally completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into his plush leather chair, his body folding inward on itself. He rested his elbows on the polished wood, buried his pale face deep in his trembling hands, and he began to weep. It was not a quiet crying. It was the absolute soul-crushing, agonizing sobbing of a man who realized he had nearly destroyed his own family. He wept for the father he had banished, for the daughter he had almost lost, and for the entire life he had built on a foundation of lies. I did not say a single word. I did not tell him that I had warned him. I did not offer any harsh lectures. I simply walked slowly around the table, my arthritic knees burning with every step, and stood next to my son. I reached out my heavy, scarred, calloused hand and placed it gently and firmly onto his shaking shoulder. I stood there, in the quiet conference room, holding my broken boy, knowing with absolute certainty that the dark poison had finally been removed from our lives, but that the long, painful process of healing was only just beginning.